watching #1 station in Hawaii. Telephone 9. Yeah.
Live from the KGMB studio, Gentleman and Francis presents 50th State Wrestling. Now, the call to action, Lord Tally-Ho Clear.
Hello again, friends, and you are my friends, and welcome back to another special edition of the 605 Super Podcast. This, a special look at the life and career of the legendary Pampero Firpo. The audio you just heard was the way 50th State Wrestling began during the peak of Pampero Firpo, or as he was known in Hawaii, the Missing Links run in the 50th State. We're going to have more classic audio later on here on this show, but what we're going to do today is explore who Pampero Firpo was. We're going to talk to various people who either knew him or got to see him or studied his career, and we're going to, from several vantage points, look at the life and career of Pampero Firpo. Here on this show today, on top of the classic audio, we're going to speak with Japanese wrestling historian Fumi Saito, as well as Hawaiian wrestling historian Bill Atkinson. We're also going to speak with Dave Burzynski from the Detroit territory, as well as Jeff Walton from the Los Angeles territory. John Arezzi joins the show to talk a little bit about his memories of Pampero Firpo in New York. We also have Flying Fred Curry, the son of Wild Bull Curry, to share his memories of the Wild Bull of the Pampas. But we're going to kick off this show right now with an extensive conversation I had with the daughter of Pampero Firpo, Mary Freese. We're going to get to know a little bit about the man and the wrestler. Let's go to this conversation right now. I am very happy today to have on the Super Podcast the daughter of Pampero Firpo, Mary Freese. Mary, thanks for being here today.
Hey, Brian. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm a huge fan of the 605 Super Podcast and everything you do. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I really appreciate that, and I'm really appreciative that you would give us some time today to talk about your father, who is a legendary figure in wrestling, but a lot of people grew up watching him. You actually grew up Firpo. You actually grew up
for sure
with Pampero Firpo as your dad, so I want to talk a little bit about that, but let's get a little bit of his background info. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking about the various places he went to and the various things he did in wrestling, but I want to know how he got there. I know that he was from Argentina, and obviously he has an Armenian last name, and Martin Kardagian, and I'm sure I'm butchering his name, is probably the most famous wrestler from Argentina. He had those big matches in Luna Park, a place that your father also wrestled. So tell me how your father first got into wrestling. Give me a little bit of his background info, but also, how did Argentina end up with such a large Armenian population?
For sure. So, yeah, those are great questions. So my father is, his father was born in Turkey. His parents were both born in Turkey in around 1910. And at that time, it was not good to be of Armenian descent in Turkey because a very militaristic regime took over. And Armenians, right now, there's been news of the Armenian genocide being recognized by Congress. So the Turks perpetrated a genocide. It was the first modern genocide against the Armenians in 1915. And because of that, my father's parents lost their parents and family members in the genocide in 1915. And there was a diaspora of Armenians who ended up leaving, because many Armenians lived in Turkey and it just wasn't safe. And historians estimate that out of 3 million Armenians, the Turks wiped out over half of the population. And also Adolf Hitler referenced the genocide in Mein Kampf, saying that nobody remembers the Armenians, so it kind of became a model for what he did with Jewish people. And a lot of Americans don't know the history because of the politics with Turkey being such a powerful ally with NATO, and Turkish government still doesn't recognize it as a genocide. They call it an uprising, even though Europe recognizes it as a genocide. So my grandparents were of Armenian descent. They left Turkey before my father was born and went to Lebanon. And then from Lebanon, they went to Argentina. I'm not exactly sure why. And so my father was born in Argentina in 1930, and half of our relatives have Spanish names like Juan and Manuel. My dad was Juan, Juan, but we have the Armenian last name. And so his father was an Olympic hopeful in boxing in the Olympics in 1936, but because of his political status as a refugee, he wasn't able to represent his country, and he ended up not being able to go to the Olympics. But he was a real shooter, and he had 79 amateur fights with 79 wins and knockouts. And my father's father kind of got my dad into the sporting life, and that was how it started, because when my grandfather couldn't make the Olympics, he then decided to run his own boxing promotion locally in Argentina as kind of a hobby. He had gotten a job. My grandfather had gotten a job in a factory. And he thought, well, on the side, when I'm not working, I'll just promote local fights. And so my father was kind of his business partner when my father was a boy, and he would get the fighters and time their fights and time the length of the rounds, and he would carry water. And so my father grew up around boxing. And that was how his interest in the sporting life began.
Did your father talk about his childhood, what it was like growing up in Argentina?
He did, yeah. He grew up pretty tough. The economy wasn't great, and his father and mother had 3 kids besides my father, and my father was the oldest, and their second child, who was a girl, passed away from health issues and probably just not being able to get the medicine that she needed because of just poverty and lack of technology and where they were living, even though it was Buenos Aires. And so he grew up pretty tough, and he said that he felt like he was in the shadow of his father because his father was a real shooter and very respected as a fighter. And he said he always felt like he was the son of so-and-so, like he wasn't really his own person because his father was such a large figure. But at the same time, fighting really intrigued him, and he wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. So he told me that as a teenager, he had tried boxing. He said, but I knocked down the opponent, and then I ran over to make sure he was okay. And he said boxing wasn't for me because my father had such a big heart. Everyone who knows him, just inside the ring, outside the ring, just that they say that he was like Saint Firpo or Mama Firpo or Papa Firpo, because he was a caretaker and a protector. So he said, I just realized boxing wasn't for me. And he was very skilled in soccer. He was skilled in track and field. So he was very athletic. And then the way he got into wrestling was he had to do mandatory military service, even though it was post-World War II. It was like late 1940s, 1949. He had to go into the Argentine army, and he did about a year and a half of military service. And one of his commanding officers saw our last name Kochmanian and thought that my dad was related to a local wrestler in Buenos Aires, and the officer wanted my dad to get him tickets to a wrestling match at Luna Park, which is a big stadium in Buenos Aires. And my dad didn't want to let down the officer, and my dad said, oh, okay, I'll go down and get you tickets. And so on his day off, my dad went to the stadium to try to procure wrestling tickets for his officer, and he ended up talking to the promoter, and they liked what they saw with him. And my father was very charming and talked about how his father was a boxer and he was athletic and wanted to work out. And I just said a star was born. He just started working out with the promoter and the boys, and that was how he got into wrestling, just by happenstance.
Do you know, did he ever say if he had seen or watched much wrestling before that point?
I don't think he did. I think it was mostly boxing, but he was really athletic. So like I said, he ran track and he played soccer and he was around boxing, but he didn't say that wrestling was really any big part of his life until he went down to the stadium and tried to get those tickets.
And what was life like as a wrestler in Argentina during those years?
You know, he was, I think, just really working hard to try to establish himself. And there were some things in his scrapbook from like the mid 1950s where just trying to come up with a character, and he wrestled as El Russo or Ivan El Terrible, wrestled as a Russian, and he just was working with a local talent. And he remembers a promoter saying to him, you really have what it takes, and so you need to establish yourself in Argentina and then get out of here. You know, go to Chile, go to Ecuador, go to Peru, and really make your way around South America and the circuit so that then you can go to Mexico and then you can go to the United States. So I think from what he says that even though Argentina wrestling was popular and Luna Park was a beautiful stadium, that from the beginning he kind of saw it as a stepping stone to achieving his dream, which was coming to the United States. That was his dream since he was a little boy.
And of course, that is what he would end up doing. He would go to Mexico and fairly quickly go from Mexico into the United States, right into Texas. Did he talk about that period in his life, coming to Mexico and then getting into the United States?
Yeah, he did. So, firstly, it was just such a cool period in history. He said that when he traveled around South America, he stayed at hotels where the Perones were staying and he kind of crossed paths with them. And
Oh,
that's
wow.
just such an interesting time to be alive. And he
Yeah.
also procured chimu, which was the shrunken head that he used in the ring. He told me that he got it from a tribal leader in Ecuador, and it was a real shrunken head that was given to him by a tribesman as a sign of respect that he admired my father's charisma and endurance and leadership. And he gave my father this real shrunken head that he picked up in Ecuador. And so it was, and my dad called it Chimu because he said that was the name for the tribe's god of good luck. And he kept that with him. And so he had so many interesting travels around South America. And my father grew up speaking Armenian because that's his ethnicity, and he spoke Spanish because that's in Argentina. And then as he traveled, he picked up Portuguese, he picked up Italian, and by the time he came to the United States, English was his fifth language that he spoke. He just had a talent for picking up languages. And I think that really helped him on his travels too, because he was able just to get over with people wherever he went and speak in their native tongue in Mexico. And so once he arrived in Mexico, he worked with all the popular wrestlers like El Santo, El Medico, Gory Guerrero, just all of those names in Mexico, again, trying to then make a name for himself so he could come up to Houston. And then Houston was the next step after wrestling in Mexico. So I think my dad always had a real soft spot for Latino wrestlers like Pedro Morales later in his career. And I think that just came from, just growing up in Argentina and just being part of that Latin culture and speaking Spanish. And I think he felt like in Mexico, in a lot of ways, he was among friends because he understood the language and he understood the culture. But again, it was a stepping stone for him to come to Texas. And he told me that it took him 6 years from when he left home. He said he left home in Argentina, then he started traveling through South America wrestling. And he said he told his mother, I'm going to come back for you and I'm going to send for you to come to America. And it took him 6 years to accomplish that. And it was just the thing in his life that he was the most proud.
You know, one of the things you just talked about was him learning different languages. And that's something that various people I've interviewed about your father have brought up. Some say he knew 5 languages, some say 6, some say 7. How many languages did he actually know?
He spoke, I'd have to count, Spanish, Armenian, Italian, Portuguese, French, English, Russian, and then he even spoke Japanese conversationally, and he understood Turkish and he understood Greek. His parents also, his father was multilingual. His father spoke Spanish, Armenian, English, Turkish, and Greek. And so he just came from this very rich background of all these different cultures. So I would say he spoke 7 languages fluently, and then he was conversant in different languages. And it just gave people such a thrill to be able to talk in their native language wherever he went. He just made a real effort to connect with people. And it was just a joy for me as a child to see that he could speak to people in so many different ways. And they would literally just hug him because they felt so happy hearing somebody trying to communicate with them in their own tongue. It was really cool.
We'll get back to his wrestling career in a second, but the topic of how many languages he spoke makes me wonder about his actual educational background. Did he go to school? How much school did he actually go to? And was he a reader? Was he someone who would read a book?
Yeah, he was. He told me when I was growing up, he said, do you know who your best friends are? And I said, yeah, Monica and Evelyn. He said, no, your best friends are classic books. And I would just start laughing. And he said, classic books, because you can read them and they have wisdom for you and you can put them away and come back to them. And he was a real... he finished high school, and then his sisters became academics. One of them became an attorney in Argentina, and the other one went into finance. He had 2 surviving sisters who are still alive at 85 and 83 years old and living here in San Jose, where my dad was living before he passed. But he said that he made a decision to go toward the sporting life, so he didn't do any post-secondary education. There are some things reported, like he taught classes in Ohio in a college or university. He never did that. So he just finished high school, and then he got his education just by traveling the world. But he loved Marcus Aurelius particularly. He loved reading philosophy. He was religious, so he loved to read the Bible. He listened to classical music. He was a real interesting Renaissance man. Apart from that wild persona that he had in the ring, he was very learned, if not with a formal education.
The late 50s was a very interesting period of time for Mexican wrestling as well as wrestling in the state of Texas. Did your father ever talk to you about any of the characters that were around, whether it be El Santo or the promoters, let's say in Houston, Morris Siegel? What did he say about the characters? I hate to use the word characters, but I will. But the characters he was around in the wrestling business during these years where he finally got into America.
Well, he said he had great respect for El Santo, and he just told me he was untouchable. Those were his words. He said he's untouchable, and just had great respect for El Santo. Gory Guerrero was another person that he enjoyed working with. And he particularly became very good friends with Don Leo Jonathan, who was his first opponent in 1957 in Houston. He referred to Morris Siegel and Paul Bosch also as just very good businessmen. They were the promoters that he worked with in Texas. And he generally just, in those early years, was trying to establish himself and trying to learn the game, and just kind of tried to straddle that line between being valuable to the promoter, but also making sure that he stood up for himself and got a fair payday. And it was especially tricky for him. He said he had to use all of his diplomacy because he didn't know the language and he didn't know American culture. And so what he said was that he idolized Antonino Rocca as a boy, and Rocca was probably 10 years older than my dad. And he said that Rocca gave him his entree into the United States because Rocca had come in through Texas and then gone to New York. And Rocca had put the word in for my dad, who also had found success on his own in Mexico. But Rocca vouched for my dad, and I think that helped him get into Houston. And then he worked programs with Rocca in New York in 1960. And so he really respected Rocca a lot as well.
And of course, he would not yet be Pampero Firpo in Texas. When he gets to New York, he becomes Pampero Firpo, but he was Ivan the Terrible in Houston, Texas, and throughout Texas. Did he ever talk about that persona, Ivan the Terrible?
I think it was just a natural thing for him in that era. If you were going to be a heel, you either were Japanese, you were a Nazi, or you were a Russian. And he just looked the part of the Russian, and he spoke the language. And I think it was just a natural character. But I've told the story before. It's in the press about how Jack Dempsey was the one who christened him. So I can tell that story if you're interested in me telling it, if you think the audience doesn't know. So my dad came from Argentina, and in his first match in the United States with Don Leo Jonathan, Jack Dempsey was a celebrity referee very early in my father's career. And my dad was wrestling as Ivan the Terrible. And my dad said that other people had that same gimmick. And so it wasn't necessarily something that would make him unique, because that Russian villain, Rasputin or Ivan the Terrible, was something other people were using. And so he became very good friends with Jack Dempsey pretty much from the moment that they met. And when Jack Dempsey was officiating my father, he said, you fight so hard and you have so much charisma. He said, you should bill yourself as the son of Luis Angel Firpo. And Dempsey, obviously being the world heavyweight champion in the 1920s, was still a major celebrity. And people remember the historic fight between Dempsey and Luis Angel Firpo, who knocked Dempsey out of the ring. And so Dempsey thought that would be a really great thing for my dad to be billed as, because it would catch the attention of fans who remember this boxer from Argentina. Now here's his son, his kayfabe son, coming in, but people thought it was real. And my dad said that appealed to him also because of his father's boxing background. He said, well, my father was a real shooter. And he said, I could see that, like I'm the son of a boxer, because he really was. And so my dad took that name, Firpo, and the Wild Bull of the Pampas, which was Luis Angel Firpo's nickname. And then a Pampero is a big hurricane that just plows through the Pampas and knocks everything over. And so Pampero Firpo, and Firpo because he was supposed to be the son of Luis Firpo, and a Pampero because he just came in like a hurricane and just knocked everything over. And so Dempsey suggested that nickname, and that was when he started using it. And at first it kind of became different incarnations in his cards. Sometimes he was billed as Ivan Firpo. And so in the beginning of his career, Ivan the Terrible, and then by probably 1960, 61, he had transitioned over to Firpo. And then, of course, in Hawaii, he was the missing link.
Well, we'll certainly talk a little bit about that in a moment, but he would go to New York. He would be here for a little while. And then it's really after that I feel like Pampero Firpo really emerges as a player in the wrestling business. He's such a memorable name, such a memorable look, such a memorable promo. When did he first start feeling comfortable with the talking? Did he ever talk to you about that?
I think he is just a talker from day one. I think that was probably the thing that he felt most comfortable with, even if English wasn't his native language. He just was a natural communicator. He found a way to get his point across. And I think, always felt comfortable with that. I think that was just a big part of his character and who he was. And I think that just developed as he continued wrestling in the United States. And I don't think it was ever an issue for him. I think he just loved to talk like I do. And so he just hit the ground running, and and obviously was known for that, and his influence on Randy Savage and other people in the business from his talking.
And of course, the expression, oh yeah, that would end up being adopted by Randy Savage and turned into his own. And I apologize to everyone for my awful version of that I just did. Did he ever explain where that came from? Or was it just something that he threw into a promo one day and stuck with it? Where did that catchphrase come from?
Well, first, I thought your impression was perfect. I thought it was great. Although I have to say that Jim does an amazing Randy Savage, oh yeah, and even he does a good one of my dad. So anyway, I thought it was great. He never mentioned where he came up with, oh yeah, but it almost, I think he just did it as an affirmation of what he was saying, because he would use that a lot of times at the end of his promo and then just walk off, but he even kind of said it in the middle of his promo, and it was almost just kind of an intensifier, an emphasis of what he had said previously. And there's an article somebody wrote about him probably in the 1960s, and it said that his broken English is a fascinating mix of $10 phrases and malapropisms and just different, and it's kind of how it was. I think he just got onto that, oh yeah, that's what I'm going to do to you. And it just became something. It was because English again was his fifth language. I think that catchphrase helped him maybe fill in the pieces or fill in the spaces, and that guttural roar, and something he became known for. But he never really mentioned where or how he invented that. He used it, and then it just seemed to get over, and it grew.
You mentioned earlier how he found Chimu. And that's another one of the things that people talk about when they talk about his promos. They remember when he would have his shrunken head, Chimu. Was it always the same shrunken head throughout his career? And whatever happened to Chimu?
Yes. Okay. So this is a really great story. So I was fascinated with my dad's wrestling career ever since I was a little girl. And my brother was born in 1970. My sister was born in 1973. And I was born in 1975. And I was born in California. So by the time I was 5 years old, 6 years old, my dad was pretty much hanging up his wrestling boots, except for a couple of comeback matches in the mid-'80s. And so I remember being in middle school or the end of elementary school, and my father kept these scrapbooks, and I put those on Twitter. If I could give a plug, my Twitter is @pfirpo1, the numeral 1, and I go through his scrapbooks and I take pictures of all of the memorabilia and I post them. And I remember looking through these when I was younger, and I'd asked my dad, I said, "Where is Chimu? I want to see Chimu." And my dad would never really talk about it. So I'd asked my mom, and my parents divorced when I was 10, and I'd asked my mom about it. I said, "What happened to Chimu?" And she said, "Well, I think your dad, when he stopped wrestling, had Chimu made into jewelry." And I thought, well, that's interesting. And do you know where the jewelry is? And nobody knew where it was. So this is just great. My sister, Julie, who was ill and passed away in 2016, unfortunately, she had cancer as a child and was given chemotherapy in the 1970s, and it damaged her heart and caused heart failure. So we lost my sister in 2016, and she and my dad and all of us, my older brother, my sister, and me, were all very close with my father. It was a huge loss for our family. And at the time that she was very ill toward the end of her life, my brother had gotten some of my dad's belongings and some of my sister's, and he was organizing them. And my dad had this Halliburton suitcase with his wrestling gear in it. And my brother had found it and gone through it. And there was a ring jacket and boots and things. Like, he had kind of the suitcase packed up, like he was ready to go to a wrestling show. And so when my sister was in the hospital, she was sleeping, and my brother and I went to go visit her. And suddenly my brother pulls Chimu out of his blue jeans pockets, like his front pocket. And he said, "Look what I found. It's Chimu." And he pulls it out and he put it right in my face. It's about the size of like a chicken leg, like a drumstick. And he just held it and just put it like 2 inches from my face. And it's just something that makes you scream. I mean, it looks like it looks like something you'd get from the Halloween spirit store, but it's a legit shrunken head. It's got hair on it and kind of like stitched up mouth. And it was just my brother used to do that when we were little. He'd bring home garter snakes and pull them out of his pocket, or crawdads. And so here we are in our 40s, and I found Chimu, and he pulls it out of his pocket and just puts it in my face. So my dad had kept Chimu. He was not made into jewelry, and he had him in a velvet bag, and he kept him in his suitcase. And that was where he stays. He's still in his velvet bag in the Halliburton suitcase, safe and sound.
Also, you still have Chimu to this day.
Chimu is a family member. He's a family treasure.
That's wonderful.
He stays in the suitcase. And I don't know, honestly, Brian, it's an eerie looking talisman. And Mike Mooneyham called it a macabre oddity. And I said, that's perfect. Like I don't know. I tried to ask my dad, was this like a family member of the tribesmen who gave it to you? Was it a political enemy? How did this shrunken head come to be? And he never, ever told me. He just said the leader was impressed with me and gave me this as a gift and a sign of respect.
So, I mean, that was one of my questions. As far as you know, this wasn't a prop. This was a legitimate shrunken head.
It's a real shrunken head. And then my dad worked it into his promos. Like his opponent was going to be next and he was going to shrink his opponent's head. And he was even billed at some parts in his career as the Argentine head shrinker, the head shrinker from the island of Borneo. In certain magazines and articles, they would work Chimu into kind of my dad's character and his lore, but it was a real shrunken head and we still have it.
That's terrific that you have that.
It's terrific, but it's a little creepy. So he stays in the velvet bag at my brother's house, safe and sound.
When your father went to work in the AWA, when he went to work for Vern Gagne, was that something he liked? Obviously, weather-wise, it was very different than what he was accustomed to. But also, did he enjoy working in the Midwest for Vern Gagne?
He did. He liked Vern Gagne a lot. He really respected Vern. And when my parents... My mom is from Milwaukee. She's a Midwestern girl, and he met my mom actually at a wrestling match in Milwaukee. She was a fan of his. And so he enjoyed working Detroit for the Sheik. He enjoyed working AWA for Vern. He liked the Midwest, but he wanted a temperate climate to live in. So when my brother had started kindergarten in 1975, my parents bought their first house in California. And so previous to that, they would just kind of have this itinerant lifestyle where he would work for Vern maybe for a year or two and have an apartment or rent something in Michigan or Minneapolis. And they lived kind of this itinerant lifestyle in the Midwest and in different territories where he worked until they settled with their home base in California. And he did like working for Vern. He had an enormous respect for Vern, for Larry Hennig, for the Crusher. He was really fond of them as people and as opponents. For Dick the Bruiser. It was funny too, because sometimes the wrestlers would call my house when I was like 7 years old, 8 years old, and they had these real gravelly voices. They would ask for Firp, and it would kind of scare me. And I remember looking at my dad's paperwork, and he had a lot of those people on his Christmas card list. Like he would exchange Christmas cards with Bulldog Don Kent and the Hennigs and the Vachons and the Crusher. And so I thought, well, that's very cordial. They're sending each other Christmas cards. And so he really did have a lot of affection for him. And toward the end of his life, it was our Sunday ritual. I would pick up my dad. He was living in assisted living about 15 minutes from my house, and I would bring him over every Sunday. And he always wanted to watch the classic wrestling on YouTube, and Lou Thez was his favorite. So he particularly loved Lou Thez versus Gagne from the Chicago Amphitheater. It's one of his favorite matches, and he always loved watching Vern wrestle. He said Vern was like a real shooter and very talented.
Is that what the other wrestlers called him, Firp?
They called him Firp, yeah. That's what they called him.
Obviously, the exact opposite of the Midwest weather would be the beautiful weather in Hawaii. And Hawaii is someplace where he left a major legacy. He was one of the biggest stars on 50th State Wrestling. People still talk about those interviews because those interviews, they had more time there than anywhere else. Did your father talk much about Hawaii? Did he talk much about becoming the missing link for Lord James Blears and Ed Francis?
Oh, absolutely. So Hawaii was his favorite place to wrestle, was his favorite place. And I learned so much from listening to you and to Jim and to your shows about how Hawaii was a stopping ground. So from the home base in California, he would wrestle in Hawaii and then go to Japan and then back to Hawaii and back to California. And he loved Hawaii. He and my mom lived on the island in 1969 and were married in Honolulu. James Blears was at his wedding, and he had a lot of respect for Ed Francis as well. And he just absolutely loved Hawaii. That was his favorite place to work. And I remember even as an adult, I got married in Hawaii in 2003. My dad was 73. And we got married in Maui, and people around the island were calling out to him and talking to him that they had recognized him, and almost in tears hugging him. Then, this was in 2003, like the impression that he had made. And he had such a love for the Hawaiian people. He was very close to Peter Maivia and Ata Johnson. My dad was very close to that family, and Peter Maivia and Nef Maiava. and the Hawaiians. And I think one of the reasons I asked him if he liked working face or heel, and he kind of chuckled and said, of course, I liked working heel. But in Hawaii, he was such a baby face. And I have friends on the island who say your father was just the best and the most popular, and we would imitate him. And I think he got a real kick out of Hawaii because he worked as a baby face and people just loved him wherever he went.
Did he ever talk about his thoughts about being rechristened the missing link in Hawaii?
You know, I didn't even know where that came from. And at my father's funeral, Dave Meltzer was there. He lives in San Jose, and I invited him to attend, and he and his colleague Garrett Gonzalez attended. And I was really pleased that they came to honor and pay respect to my father. And Dave had said that Ed Francis thought Pampero Firpo was a lousy name, and they wanted to just change it. And I think it was Ed Francis who came up with the missing link, according to Dave. And Dave had interviewed my father at different times in his career. So I never had heard that story, but I believe what he said, and it sounds like that would be something accurate. And people would call Peter Maivia the chief, and they would call Nef Mayava the prince, and then they would call my father the link. And the three of them often worked together and hung out together outside of the ring.
Did your father ever talk about Ripper Collins or Johnny Barron?
He did. I think he more considered them kind of showman type wrestlers. And he had just, he talked briefly about them. Like he didn't ever say that he had heat with anybody that he worked with. And I just would show him pictures of Johnny Barron, and he had the big cigar sticking out of his mouth when he worked in Hawaii. My dad would just kind of chuckle and say he was a real showman. And the same thing with Ripper Collins, that he was a real showman. And I have a funny Hawaii story about Hawaii Five-0 that I could tell you.
Yeah, please.
Okay, good. So I love telling stories about my dad. So my mom remembered that Hawaii Five-0 was starring Jack Lord. It was a crime detective series, and it ran from 1968 to 1980, and it was filmed on location in Honolulu. And my father lived there and was wrestling, and like I said, was a big star on the island. So he had gotten recruited to be in an episode of Hawaii Five-0, and he had gone down to meet with the writers and the director and the producer, and they had given my dad a script. And what was supposed to happen was that my dad was supposed to be in a building menacing some helpless citizens and assaulting them, and then some shadowy villain, and he was beating up on these helpless people. And then Jack Lord was supposed to come in and save the day, and then interfere with my father and save the people. And so my dad had read that script, and he did not want to have that be the way the show went. So my father decided to rewrite the script because this is just not acceptable to him that this is how it's going to go. So he went to talk to the writer, and he started to explain to them what's going to happen is that these innocent, helpless citizens will be assaulted in a building by somebody else. And then he said, I will suddenly appear in the door frame, like block the door frame with his big, stocky physique. And he said the people assaulting them will turn their head and look at me. I'll be in the door frame, and they'll yell, run for your lives. It's the missing link. And then he would say, oh, yeah. And then the people assaulting these victims would take off in fear. My dad would go save the day, be the hero, help soothe the people who are being assaulted. And then Jack Lord would come in and thank my dad and say, nobody else could have saved these people except for the missing link. You're the true hero. You saved the day. So my dad is explaining this to the writer and the director, and he's going to be the main event if he's going to be in the show at all. And so the director was just kind of listening to him somewhat impassively. And, how writers are when you interfere with their script. And they said, well, I kind of sighed and said, thank you, Mr. Link, very much for this feedback. But if you're going to be in the show, you have to stick to the script. And so my dad pretty much said, well, thank you for the opportunity, and I'm not interested, and just left the meeting and never appeared in the show.
It's a great story, though.
It's a great story. I said, if he's not the main event, he's not going to be saving the day. He wasn't interested. And I think that also speaks to his protecting of the business, because like I said before, I really didn't know all that much about some of the comings and goings in his career. I think I told you this before, how I really learned by listening to you and listening to Jim Cornette, listening to Dave, and listening to these wonderful historians about his career, because he didn't talk much about it. He just called it his professional ethic. And he was of that era where you just protected the business. When he was a heel, he carried a gun. He couldn't be seen with the baby faces. It was a separate locker room. So I'm sure that not only just wanting to be the star of the show, he was also wanting to protect his character, that he's not going to appear in a show as a villain because he's known as a babyface. And so he wanted to make sure that wherever he was represented, he was kayfabe the way that he was in wrestling with his character. And so I really respected that about him, that he had no knowledge of shoot interviews. He had no knowledge of people exposing their own personal business. And so to the very end, he just went to the grave with a lot of people's secrets. And he really, he said it was respect for the business. It was his professional ethic. And if my friends or people would ask him, well, is it fake? He'd say that's a very touchy word with me. And he wouldn't ever expose anything about wrestling, even to his own family.
What do you know about your father's stomach injury in Hawaii, which obviously would impact the rest of his career and the way he was able to work in the ring?
So I'd asked my mom about that, and Lanny Poffo does a great impression of my dad, and we love the Poffo family, Lanny and Randy and Judy and Angelo, and so Lanny always says, don't touch me in my stomach or I will die. So my mom said that she thinks it was some kind of maybe diverticulitis or some kind of intestine perforation. I don't know if she's even really sure what happened. And I just know he was in the hospital in Hawaii and just had this internal intestinal injury. And I think in the wrestling magazines, they kayfabe to make a story up like he was assaulted in a riot and got stabbed by somebody in the crowd. And like I said, sometimes I don't even know what's real or what's imagined. I remember I talked to Joanne Dusick, who's the daughter of Omaha promoter Joe Dusick, and she's a close friend of my father's. And I said, does that sound right to you? Did he get stabbed in Omaha? Is that why his stomach was injured? And she said, no, that really didn't happen. So as far as I know, it was an internal injury that didn't have anything to do with necessarily being injured in the wrestling ring, but even I don't know the real story. Yeah,
because I've heard various different stories from him getting stabbed to him getting injured in a match with Johnny Barron. I'm not exactly sure.
I'm not either, and I'm his daughter, and I've heard that Johnny Barron's the same way. He had just a really, really visible scar. It was like a super ugly, just real visible scar, all from his sternum, just past his belly button, just like somebody had just filleted him open. He had this real big scar there, and I wish I knew more of it too. He just didn't talk about it.
So while he's working in Hawaii, he still has a place on the mainland. Did your father and your mother have a headquarters in the mainland?
I don't think they bought their house until early 1970s. And so when he came through the United States in 1957, he had sent for his family, which at the time were his two parents and his two younger sisters who were living in Buenos Aires. And he brought them across the border in a country squire station wagon. And it was like the American dream. He established his family in the United States. And so his sisters and his parents were living in San Jose, which is where I was born and raised and where we still live. And my dad and my brother, his sisters, his parents passed away here. So everyone still lives in San Jose, but he didn't buy his house until probably the early 70s. So I think what was happening was he was either renting a place or maybe staying with his parents in between the traveling. And then my mom recalls that when my brother started kindergarten in 1975, she said, we really just have to choose a place because we can't be pulling him out of school just to travel and relocate. Because I think my brother was in school for a while in Michigan or school for a while in Minnesota. But my mom said, we really need to settle in California. And then once he started going to school, she pretty much stayed in California, and my dad would go on the road and then would come back to the house that they owned.
Well, that's one of the things, even when he was main eventing in Detroit, first as a heel and then as a babyface, he was still going into New York. He was still going into Los Angeles. He was someone who was always on the move, even though he had a main territory that he worked in. He still was main eventing in various different places.
Yeah, for sure. And I had mentioned Lanny Poffo. I want to tell one more story about Buddy Rogers with my dad, because I was talking about how my dad was so tight-lipped about the professional ethic of his business and wouldn't really say anything. And so when my dad was born in 1930. And so, like I said, I would bring my dad over every Sunday, and I have two children who are his only grandchildren. My son Tommy is 12. My daughter Cindy is 9. And since they've been babies, I'd bring my dad over. He would drive over to the house when the kids were born and spend time with the grandchildren and just kind of while away the afternoon watching the kids, playing with their friends. And he would sit at my dining room table, and I would put wrestling for him on YouTube, and I would do chores and laundry and cook and we'd have dinner together. And so he was particularly interested in a Lou Thesz match with Buddy Rogers. And I'd asked my dad about Buddy Rogers. He was such a showman. I enjoyed watching the match as well. And it was such a different character for 1960 with that nature boy and almost kind of like a Gorgeous George. But I could tell the fans were hostile to him and the announcers were hostile toward Buddy Rogers. And he seemed so arrogant and flamboyant. And I'd asked my dad, I said, tell me about Buddy Rogers. And he said, well, Buddy Rogers was a real showman. He said he was a real professional and he was a real showman. And my dad would make a distinction between that and say somebody like Vern Gagne or the Iron Sheik, who he said, well, he was a real shooter, like he was a real legit shooter. Or Danny Hodge, he was a real shooter. Or Lou Thesz, he's a real shooter. But with Buddy Rogers, he'd say, well, he was a real showman. And I said, well, tell me about him. And all he would say is he'd say, Buddy knew that I had his back. And I didn't know what that meant. And so Tim Hornbaker, who wrote Death of the Territories, I know you've mentioned that book. And if anybody listening hasn't read it, it's a great book. Tim Hornbaker is writing a book right now on Buddy Rogers. And so Tim had asked me through Twitter, he said, does your dad have any stories about Buddy Rogers? And I said, well, all he would tell me is that Buddy knew he had his back. And my dad and Buddy wrestled against each other and worked programs in different places, including New York. And I said, he just won't really fill in the story. So I asked Lanny Poffo, who's just the wrestling genius and knows everything. And so the story that Lanny told me was that Buddy and my dad were in St. Louis, and Buddy had provoked hostility from the crowd like he does, and he came to the ring and was being flamboyant and arrogant. And as Lanny and Tim Hornbaker both said, Buddy had a lot of heat backstage with the boys because he was just difficult and generally unlikable, and he had his clique of people, but he had kind of alienated the dressing room. And so my dad kind of tried to stay out of those political clique type things and tried to be diplomatic and kind of stay out of the politics and just kind of do his own thing. And I think my dad maybe got away with that a little bit more because he wasn't an American. He was kind of a foreigner anyway, and I think that kind of helped my dad stay out of maybe some of the drama that was happening backstage. So Buddy had finished his match, and as he was walking back to the dressing room in St. Louis, a fan came out of nowhere and took a glass bottle and smashed it over Buddy's head, and it's really painful injury, and he kind of staggered back to the dressing room, and he had shards of glass in his scalp, and he was bleeding profusely. And when Buddy came back to the dressing room, none of the other boys would help him. And so my dad, just seeing him in this sorry state and just feeling this human sympathy for him, took his comb out of his travel bag and just very gently started combing the shards of glass out of Buddy's scalp and soothing him and talking to him. And Lanny imitates him and he says, I'm not a medical professional, Buddy, but I think you might need to get this looked at. It might need some stitches. And so it just speaks to his kind heart. And that's something, he's so kind. Even when he was in his assisted living facility, he would walk through the hallways and he would make sure he'd open the doors for people. And when he was in the dining hall, he would pour people's water and make sure that they had silverware and that they were eating enough. And he was just the caretaker. And when I was having Thanksgiving dinner with him at his facility a couple of years ago, a woman approached me and she looked to be in her 70s. And I assumed that she was a resident at the time my dad was 87. And she said, I just want to say what a gentleman your father is. I said, thank you. That's very sweet. And she said, he takes such good care of my mother. And she said that her mother was 102 and living in the community. And she said, your father always makes sure that she's seated and that she's taken care of and has what she needs. And she said, your father is just such a gentleman. And then a man who was eating at the table overheard us. And he said, oh, yes. He said, that's very true. Your father is just so kind to everyone. He said, plus, he's so sharply dressed. He said, your father always, he said, look at him. He has that button-down shirt on and the tie and the sport coat. And he really was. He always was impeccably groomed. He just looked like the champ, like wearing a suit and a tie. And even when I brought him, I used to bring him to show and tell when I was in like third grade. I would just bring him as the guest speaker. You know, here's my dad. And he would come wearing a suit and just always looked so sharply dressed. And so the man next to me was admiring his fashion and said, he just looks so good. And he said, what kind of industry was your dad in? Where did he work? Was he a clothing designer or did he work in the fashion industry? I just started laughing. But he was so kind-hearted. And back to Lanny Poffo, he's a good family friend. And he said the same thing. He said, your dad and my dad, Angelo Poffo, he said they had great respect and affection for each other because they were just these old school guys, Italian for Angelo Poffo and my dad being Armenian. And there are so many Italians who live in Argentina. And they just were so old school and just so respectful of people and just had such kind hearts. And Lanny told me that he had heard the Buddy Rogers story along with many other stories from my father when Lanny was riding with Angelo and my father and just making towns in the Midwest. And he said, your dad just loved to talk. And then he and my dad would speak in Italian. And he said that was where he heard the Buddy Rogers story. So he's been a great source of information for me as I try to piece together these things of my father's career.
Where do you think it came from, the desire to always be dressed impeccably? Obviously, he grew up very poor. When do you think it started, and where do you think it comes from? Like, mentally, what do you think was going through his mind when he dressed himself?
I think he just is a vain creature like I am. I always have to be nicely dressed. I always have to have my makeup on and my hair coiffed. I think that's just part of who he is. I think it was a personal pride for him that he always was just very sharp looking. And I think he also really respected people like Luthez, who when he was the champ, he looked like the champ and he dressed the part and he was always carried himself with dignity and with professionalism. And I think that my dad, it reminds me of the adage of dress for the job you want, not the job that you have. And so I think that was part of it too, that he just sensed that he had a greater destiny and he was striving to always improve himself personally. And if he looked the part, if he looked like the champ, if he dressed in a suit, if he carried himself well, if he was kind to people, if he was well spoken, if he was diplomatic, I think he saw those things as keys to success.
I want to ask you about your father in Detroit, but before I get there, did he ever talk to you about Vince McMahon Sr.? And in general, what promoters were his favorite promoters?
Yes, so his favorite promoters were Joe Dusick in Omaha, Nebraska. And Joe Dusick's wife is named Ann, and Joe and Ann had one child who's a daughter named Joanne, and she's turning 81 this year and lives in Omaha, and she's still a family friend. She's kind of like a grandmother to me, and we made weekly phone calls to Joanne and see how she's doing because both of her parents have passed away. So he really had great respect for the Dusicks, and not just Joe, but the rest of the Riot Squad like Emil and Ernie and Rudy. And I think that early on, the Dusicks in Nebraska in the 1950s and 60s helped my dad with his career and helped him acclimate to American culture. And he said Joe Dusick was just an honest person, which you don't hear sometimes about promoters, especially from the boys. So he always just had great reverence and respect for Joe Dusick. And he also had a Jim Barnett impression, and he would imitate Jim Barnett talking to Nick Bockwinkel. He'd go, "Nicky, my boy." Everyone has a Jim Barnett impression. So he said that he loved working for Jim Barnett in Australia because he said Jim Barnett was a good businessman and he had money. And he said he always knew he was going to get a good payday with Jim Barnett. So he really respected Jim Barnett as a promoter. And he also talked about Morris Siegel and Paul Bosch as being good businessmen. He didn't talk much about Vince Sr., but I know that when he was brought in with Vince Sr. to work programs with Pedro and Bruno, that he respected. It sounded like Vince Sr. gave my dad some creative license for how to work the match and how to get over as a heel and how to, beat up on Pedro or get some heat by beating up on Bruno as a heel with the audience. And my dad talks about like the little old ladies just, going crazy and trying to hit him and hurt him while he's beating up the champion. And so I think he felt that Vince Sr. gave him that creative license to figure out how to promote his character.
Detroit is one of the places where your father is most closely associated. I think there's various different places where he would be on the Mount Rushmore. Hawaii for certain, probably Northern California, and Detroit. What did he tell you about Detroit? Did he enjoy working for the Sheik? And in general, a lot of these guys who have Middle Eastern backgrounds, did they all stick together? Did he ever talk about that, whether it was Wild Bull Curry, who was Lebanese, or the Sheik, or, of course, your father or anyone else? What was it like working for the Sheik? And then did he feel a kinship with other guys of Middle Eastern descent?
Yeah, for sure. For sure he did. And especially I'd mentioned before with the Hispanic people like Pedro Morales, he always said he's such a good kid. Like he loved Pedro and he loves hearing Pedro speak in Spanish for his promos and things like that. So wrestlers who spoke Spanish and were either like Mexican or Dominican or Puerto Rican, like that really was over with my dad. And then, like you said, people like the Currys who are Lebanese, he really, really liked Bull Curry and Fred Curry. And he always chuckles and said, well, Freddie was a really good kid. Like he really liked that family. And I think for a number of years, he had a good working relationship with the Sheik. And I think they respected each other as professionals, but there was some falling out that the two of them had, and it was probably over a payday where my father felt shorted or whatever it was. And he spoke favorably of the Sheik and his wife. I think his wife was named Joyce, and would talk about like spending time with them outside the ring. But I think at some point they had some kind of a falling out, and it wasn't anything that he really talked about, but I think that maybe kind of tempered their friendship in later years. But I know that there was a lot of friendship there and that they got along well for a lot of their career. And yeah.
Did he get along with Roy Shire? And was he happy working in the San Jose area and San Francisco area, considering his family was there?
Yeah, I think that was great because he was local and he didn't have to get on a plane or drive hours and hours to make a town. So that was wonderful. And I know Dave Meltzer talks a lot about when Dave came to San Jose as a child and how wrestling was on KTVU. And in fact, my sister and my brother, who are a little older than I am, particularly remember also kids on the playground saying, I saw Julie and John's dad on TV yesterday. So it was really cool for our family because he was this local celebrity and we were in the Bay Area while he was doing that. So he really liked working in the Bay Area. And then he also crossed paths again with Peter Maivia. He really liked Pepper Gomez, and he had great respect for Ray Stevens. Ray Stevens was one of his favorite people. And whenever I would show him, when he'd come over on Sundays, we sometimes would watch Bobby Heenan doing promos with Nick Bockwinkel and Ray Stevens for the AWA. And my dad would just laugh and laugh. And he would just go, Bobby's such a good talker. And he said Ray was so professional. And those were some of the people he crossed paths with in the Bay Area. So I know that he really, really liked working there, but he didn't say much about Shire.
What about Japan? I know that you must get a kick out of seeing pictures of your dad managing the Convict over in Japan, but did he ever talk about Japan? He did 4 tours.
He did. Yeah, he loved Japan. And I appreciate you having Fumi on the show. I love hearing Fumi talk about Japan. And he absolutely loved Japan. He loved the culture. In fact, his primary care physician, we have an HMO called Kaiser, and my dad would just do annual checkups. And his doctor was a man in his 50s who was Japanese, and that was totally over with my dad. He just had like a love for Japanese people, and he would speak some of his Japanese phrases to him, and I would show him some of the pictures from my dad from Japan, and he just he loved the culture, and particularly the filial aspects of the sons and daughters just showing deference to their parents and to elder people, because that was always how he was with his own parents, and the family respect. And he loved the culture. He loved going to Japan. He had beautiful clothing made, like we talked about his tailoring, just beautiful like silk shirts and one of a kind that he still had in his collection in his closet, like monogram things. And he just loved working there. He absolutely loved it. And so he would bring us, my sister and me, bring us dolls back from Japan. And that was so cool, little souvenirs and things from all over. So that was something he loved going there. He had the Japanese airline bags, and he'd have like a New Japan or All Japan jackets and things like that. And he also really liked Baba and Inoki, both of them. And there's some video I put up on YouTube of my dad at Cauliflower Alley Club talking to Inoki, and he had great relationships with Baba, with Inoki. And he loved being over there. That was a real thrill for him. And he wrestled in 21 different countries across 5 different continents, and Japan was one of his favorites for sure.
You put up some video that I really, really liked, and I wish there was more of it, of your father running into Bruno Sammartino, and Roddy Piper, almost like a little kid, is hanging in the background saying, "Excuse me, can I have a photo?" But Bruno really seems happy to see your dad. It almost seems like he can't believe this is Pampero Firpo.
Oh, yeah, that was so cool. And I was really grateful to Lanny, because that was the year that Lanny Passo's brother, Macho Man Randy Savage, was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. And it was in our backyard in San Jose. And so Lanny had invited my family to attend with him. And that was just such a thrill, too, just because of the connection with our families for so many years. And so my older brother was there. And my older brother is like bigger and stronger than I am and could kind of help and assist my dad, because my dad was 85 at the time and always loved Bruno. Bruno was another just old school guy that was similar to Angelo Poffo and to my dad, and just had those old world values. And it was so cool when I had initially gone ahead into the hotel and to the stadium, the Levi Stadium where it was. And as soon as I saw Bruno there, I called my brother and said, you have to get Dad down here. You know, he probably hadn't seen Bruno since the 1970s. And that was just such a thrill. And it was just really cool. I remember being in the hallway in that video where I shot that video with Piper and with Bruno, and I wish I would have shot more of it. I just myself was in awe of this meeting. And so Bruno turns and just says, Pampero Firpo, with that Italian accent. And they just had great affection for each other. And they worked those programs in the 70s. And I think it was in Madison Square Garden. I think you would probably know better than I would. It was just so cool. And I was so grateful that Lanny made that opportunity for us just to make those connections and get those pictures. And Piper, I wasn't quite sure how my dad had crossed paths with Piper. And as a kid, I remember being in middle school, and these were my favorites, like Hulk Hogan, Roddy Piper, Randy Savage. These were just the people I grew up watching as a kid. And so that was a huge thrill for me to see Roddy Piper. And so Dave Meltzer told me at my father's funeral that Piper and my dad crossed paths in 1980 when my dad was 50 and at the tail end of his career, working for Mike LaBelle in Los Angeles. And so that was where Piper and my dad had crossed paths. And then Piper told us, that was another video I posted. Again, I wish I had more footage. Piper said that he rode up and down with the Vachons, with Mad Dog Vachon and Butcher Vachon. And that was, my dad had broken into the United States with when the Vachons were also, and the Vachons also wrestled as Russian characters before they became Butcher Vachon and Mad Dog Vachon. I think it was like Nikolai Zolotov. Maybe I'm probably getting that name wrong, but the Vachons had Russian characters like my dad did, and they worked together as Russians from the 1950s. So Roddy Piper said that when Piper was breaking into the business, he said, I was kind of mentored by Mad Dog, and he said Mad Dog and Butcher would go up and down the road with Piper and tell Piper these stories of the ribs they had pulled on my dad, like affectionately, but, just to kind of appease their boredom. And so Piper said in particular, there was this one rib that they pulled on your dad, and they were so proud of it. And Piper said, Mad Dog and Butcher would tell me the story every single time I saw them. Like they would just go up and down the road, and he said he would tell me the story about pulling this rib on your dad. And it's a great story. And it was so cool to see them again. So I don't think Piper and my dad had seen each other for over 30 years when they saw each other in the hallway at WrestleMania. It was really cool.
What is the rib story?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. I would love to tell you. So So this is such a great story. I love it. So there was a Canadian wrestling series called Wrestling with the Past, and it was like the Canadian Comedy Central channel, like equivalent to what we have in the United States. And it was like 1999, 2000, maybe 2001. It was like a 6-episode series called Wrestling with the Past. And in the first episode, my dad and Butcher Vachon and Mad Dog Vachon were telling these stories about their time on the road. So the rib story was that my dad was on the road and he had just come to Texas. This is like 1950s. And the champion at the time was Vincent Lopez. And Vincent Lopez was driving a car, just going from town to town to a wrestling show or from a wrestling show. And Vincent Lopez was driving, and Butcher Vachon, then known as Nikolai Zolotov, or the Russian name, what he was wrestling as, was in the passenger seat. And my dad, known as Ivan the Terrible, had fallen asleep in the back seat. And so Vincent Lopez turns to Butcher while my dad is sleeping, and he said, I'm bored. Let's have some fun. Just follow my lead. So Lopez slams on the brakes, and my dad just flies into the driver and passenger seat and jolts awake, and Lopez starts wailing, and he's saying, I didn't see him. I didn't see him. I didn't see him. And my dad is kind of groggy and says, what are you talking about? And Butcher says, Lopez just hit a bicyclist. He hit a bicyclist in the car. And Lopez said, I'm going to go pull over and go take a look. So Lopez pulls over, gets out of the car, goes and takes a look, and my dad and Butcher are inside the car, and my dad's just woken up and kind of freaked out. And Lopez comes back in, and he said he's really injured. And he said, I need to finish him off. We can't have any witnesses. So Lopez pulls out a gun. And of course, there is no bicyclist. He's making this whole story up. And so Lopez pulls out a gun, walks back to this alleged injured bicyclist, 50 yards away from the car, and it's dark and nobody can see what's going on. And then Lopez fires the gun. So my dad hears, he's like, boom, boom, boom. Lopez comes back and said, okay, he's done. I took care of him. And he said also he was wearing this ring, and he said I couldn't get it off his finger, so I just cut off his finger and took the bicyclist ring. So here's a souvenir I have from this guy that we just hit. So he shows the ring to my dad. And of course, the butcher is in on this rib, and my dad has no idea. And so Piper, when he was telling the story to my dad and my brother and me in San Jose, he said, of course, your dad is freaking out in 17 different languages because he has like no idea what's just happened. And suddenly he's an accessory to murder. And my dad remembers it saying, I was just recently in the country. I'm on a visa. He said, all my dreams of being an American citizen are suddenly, and I think my dad said initially too, he said, you need to call the police after he'd hit the bicyclist. And Lopez said, not with my record, I'm going to take care of it myself. And so my dad thinks that this innocent man was just killed, that he is an accomplice now. And he's in the back, and Lopez is the champ. And so again, just my dad has recently arrived and just kind of has to go with what's happening here and didn't know what to do. And so they just kind of calmly drove away. And my dad's in the back of the car thinking, what am I going to do now? And they're driving toward the hotel. And as they're driving, I think Butcher had fallen asleep, and Lopez turns to my dad and he says in Spanish, we have to get rid of Butcher because we can't have any witnesses to this either. And I don't trust him. He said, I don't trust Butcher. We have to get rid of him. So Lopez tells my dad that he's going to that Lopez is going to kill Butcher when they get to the hotel. And so my dad, again, just is beside himself. He doesn't know what to do. And so my dad kept watch out of Butcher's hotel room and just kind of stood in the hallway and said, Butcher, he said, Paul, don't leave your hotel. Don't leave your room for 24 hours. Like Vincent Lopez is coming to kill you. And Paul, of course, is in on the rib. And so my dad has this sleepless night. And I think they told him the next morning. And so Vincent Lopez had passed away by the time that they had shot the Wrestling with the Past series. And my dad is kind of reliving this. And my dad looks like he's almost kind of getting angry here in like the year 2000, telling this story as he's hearing Butcher and Mad Dog kind of laughing, recalling this rib that they had pulled on him. And my dad said, I was mad, man. I was real mad. And then he almost looks like he has this PTSD kind of flashback, like he's going back into that. And Butcher just kind of puts his arm around him, and Mad Dog, he goes, it's okay, Firp. We were different people then. I was Ivan Zolotov or Nikolai said, and you were Ivan the Terrible. And he said, we were just different people, and ha, 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 let bygones be bygones. My dad just kind of starts this like uneasy laughter and just kind of snaps out of it a little bit. But you could tell it was like this very significant event for him that he was kind of traumatized by that, and I was watching that and I thought, oh my gosh, I could not have lasted 10 minutes in the wrestling business. I just don't know how he made a career out of over 30 years in this type of environment.
Well, let's talk about the end when he decided to get out of the ring. You mentioned running into Roddy Piper in 1980 in Los Angeles. I talked to Jeff Walton from the Los Angeles office a little bit about his memories of Pampero Firpo, and he talked about a conversation they had around this period of time where Pampero Firpo was concerned because he didn't have insurance and he had a sick daughter.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, he was an older guy by this period of time. He was, like you said, he was 50 years old in 1980. How much of him getting out of wrestling was his age? How much of it was a concern about your sister? How much did your sister's illness affect him during this period of time?
That's a really, really good question. And I think about that interview. I'm a huge Roddy Piper fan. And I think about that interview that Piper got fired for. And when he did the interview for HBO, are you familiar?
With Real Sports, yeah.
Yes. And Piper's line was, wrestling has a great entrance plan and something like it doesn't have an exit plan, right? And I always resonated with that line. So here's my dad from Argentina with a high school education, and his work experience is just through wrestling. And he talks about different wrestlers and promoters being interested in him going into a managerial role, like being a manager, being a road agent. But my sister is diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma, which is a non-genetic bone tumor that was cancerous in her leg. And we were living in California, we were living in San Jose, and we were close to Stanford Hospital, which is just world-renowned medical care. And that was in 1979. And so my mom was with the three of us. My brother was 9 and my sister was 6 and I was 4 years old and my dad was on the road. And so I think that, and like you said, he was getting older and, his daughter needs this medical care. So she got the chemotherapy for a couple of years and she was in remission from cancer for the rest of her life. But the reason she passed so young was because the chemotherapy drug that she was given called adriamycin damaged her heart and she passed from heart failure at such a young age, which was an unintended consequence from the medication she was given as a child. However, at the time that she was ill, she still had a reasonably good prognosis that if she could go through the chemo and get treatment that she could recover and be in remission, which she was until she was in her 40s and passed away. So I think at that point, like you said, my dad, who was kind of beaten up a little bit, he was almost 50 years old. It was kind of time to hang things up. And he didn't want to take the offers he'd had about going on the road or managing or being an agent, or with all of his multi-languages, he could kind of be an intermediary for the wrestlers who came from other countries. And he just had this sense that he didn't want to be on the road anymore. And I think a big part of that was wanting to be there for my family and my sister while she was going through those treatments. That was when he kind of hung it up.
And that was a big change. He went from being a professional wrestler of world renown to working for the post office. What do you remember about that transition? Obviously, you were very young, but I'm sure you must have heard things.
Yeah.
But also, when was the first time you saw your father without the long hair and without the facial hair?
Oh my gosh, that was probably 1984, 1985. So he kept that look until, and he didn't look wild. He didn't wear his hair like an afro. He would put it back in a ponytail. Some of his pictures look like that, or his wedding picture. He still had the long hair, but he would put it back in a ponytail and kind of trim his beard. But I remember I was so traumatized when I saw him without that beard. I thought, oh my gosh, it just doesn't even look like him. That was probably when I was around 10 or 11. He pretty much shaved the beard and then never grew it back. Like, he just shaved the beard and then he cut his hair. And one of my favorite lines from him was Bill Apter had talked to my dad and said, "What happened to all your hair?" And this interview is on YouTube with Bill Apter and my dad from 2012. My dad was 82. And my dad kind of chuckled and said, "Well, time comes when you have to look a little more acceptable to society, you know." And so I think, and I really admire him, because what had happened was he got out of wrestling and didn't immediately get on with the post office. And so he had a family to feed and a mortgage to pay and had to, put food on the table. And my mom was a stay-at-home mom. So I really admire him. He worked at some point 2 and 3 jobs. Like, just he would get on with the company and try to sell. Like, he got a salesperson job at one point because he was so charismatic and could talk to people. And then he got a job doing security at the local shopping mall. He worked at a gas station here locally, just trying to find something that could be more permanent with a better salary. And it took him a couple of years to get on with the post office. And that was a huge blessing, because he was just those federal jobs. I'm a public school teacher and they have a pension, and not like what Roddy Piper said, this is the opposite. There's a great exit plan with the post office or with being law enforcement or with being a public school teacher. So he worked until he was 78 and he finally retired in 2008. And I'll tell you, he probably had another 4 or 5 years in him. He was strong as an ox. He never delivered mail, but he did processing and would lift the mail sacks. And he received numerous commendation letters in his postal career and was Employee of the Month and Employee of the Year. And they would sometimes do write-ups in their postal magazine about how the Wild Bull of the Pampas is working third shift as mail handler 7054 or whatever it was. So he had some notoriety within the department, and many of his colleagues were Filipino and from different places internationally, and he would talk to them. And he was kind of a star at the post office, just with his work ethic and his honesty. Sometimes he would find sums of money and things that were unaccounted for and turn those in. And it became a real blessing, I think, for him and for our family that he got on with the post office. And that was what was able to sustain him economically when he retired, with his benefits and his pension. And it was like a really cool second chapter in his life. I was very proud of him that he didn't hesitate to get a real or more conventional job to support himself and to support us after he finished wrestling. It was really commendable.
Did he enjoy being recognized by people after he left the wrestling business? And also, did he keep up with it? Did he keep up with any of his former colleagues? And did he actually watch any wrestling on TV?
Yeah, he did. He had a real love for the wrestling business, and he had such a love for wrestling fans. And when he got his award at Cauliflower Alley Club in 2001, Nick Bockwinkel had invited my dad, and my dad was giving the speech, and I also put that on YouTube. And the first thing he says is, he said, "Wrestling fans, if you're a wrestling fan, raise your hand." And he says, "To all of you, I just want to give my deepest thanks for allowing me to achieve my dream and to bring my family here." And he just had a deep love for the fans, and he didn't ever refer to them derisively or as marks or try to speculate with them or take advantage. He had a real sense of that he owed his dream. He owed his gratitude. He said to the fans who demanded my action, whether they loved me or hated me, they came to see me and they kept me in business. And so he had a real love for that. And when people recognized him, he had this beautiful signature. He would do, it almost looked like calligraphy, which was his handwriting. And again, it was so funny to see this wild looking character. And he had this beautiful, it looked like a colonial, like a George Washington type signature, and he would not hesitate to sign autographs, or if people would try to pay him, he said, no. He would always just loved interacting with people. He also maintained his physique. He was very active. He looked very young, really young. He always looked 20 years younger than he was, and he would go to the local gym. He would do some personal training for people, and he would just chop it up with people at the gym and tell them wrestling stories. And he kept himself like physically in shape. He always said he stayed away from cigarettes, alcohol, drugs. Like he loved training. He loved talking to people. A lot of the people at the local gym where he worked out wanted some of his training tips and to talk to him about wrestling. And he loved all of that. I loved him being recognized. I thought that was just so cool. And whenever he was approached by people, they just had a love for him. Little children loved him. Elderly people loved him. It's like you just could sense that he was such a good, decent, big-hearted guy. He just was the most wonderful father. And I appreciate this outpouring of love from the wrestling community after my dad has passed. And I think one of the reasons I'm so at peace with his passing is because he was at peace with it. And he lived, I count him as 90 years old, even though he didn't quite make it till his birthday in April. He's born in 1930 and he passed on January 9th, 2020. And I thought, he made it to 2020. I'm going to consider him 90 years old. And he expressed a real peace for what he accomplished. He said many times, I accomplished my destiny. And he did that through wrestling and with the love of the wrestling fans and through his hard work. And he was very much at peace with his life and his legacy. And I just think you can't ask for anything else. And so I'm also very much at peace with the life that he lived and the legacy and the memories he left behind. I love hearing from people, and he did too. My brother and I got fan letters mailed to our house throughout our whole lives, even up until the end. John and I probably get 1 or 2 letters every month from people sharing their stories, asking for autographs, sending pictures, and he just did that without hesitation. He was always very grateful that people remembered him and his career, and so are we. My brother and I love that. We love hearing from people, and we're really grateful for that.
So many guys get out of the wrestling business and they don't take anything with them. They don't keep anything. They don't clip anything out of the newspaper, or they don't have any of the magazines or programs. Your father had these scrapbooks. Talk a little bit about them, and did you ever talk to him about why he did that? He is rather unique in wrestling in that he actually tracked where he went and all the articles. Seems like everything he can get his hands on, he kept
it's so cool.
Scrapbooks.
It was so cool. And and you asked also if he kept up with friends in the business and watched wrestling, and he did. Like he didn't watch it consistently. He didn't watch Raw or, WCW like every single week and things like that. But he loved hearing from people. And I think he would talk to Nick Bockwinkel occasionally and different people in the business. And, even the younger generation too, when he went to a house show when WWE was in San Jose, and he really had a section for the business. He really did. But his scrapbooks, he told me the other day, and I just, oh my gosh, I lost my mind. He said that he had a ton of other memorabilia from those early years in South America and Mexico that he tossed when he was moving from someplace to someplace else. And I thought, oh my gosh, because I couldn't even believe it. My heart just sunk because it's so priceless. They're just such treasures. So he has things from his career. The earliest ones are like 1952, 1954, and that was in Argentina. He has a picture that says my first professional wrestling match, and it's dated 1952. And I think part of the reason he cataloged things was because he wasn't a partier. So he didn't go out with nightlife and drinking and partying and things like that. So I think that was something, it just makes me laugh to think of Pampero Firpo, like in his hotel room scrapbooking, like saving these mementos. But I think part of the reason he did that was because it gave him something to do that was constructive. And I think he also was really proud of himself and what he was achieving, that he set out from Argentina on his own and made it in the United States. And he headlined wherever he went and was a box office draw and a main event. And so he shared those clippings with his family back home. And I think that was another reason that he kept those scrapbooks, was that he could show his family what he was doing. So he was very close to this is before I was born. His family was his sisters and his parents, and he was very close with them. And so I think that was part of it too. And I don't know that he even kept those for his children, because like I said, I was the one who was fascinated by those scrapbooks, and he had them on the bookshelf when I was growing up in our home. My parents divorced when I was 10 years old. And when he moved out of the house, he and my mother still had an amicable relationship, and he was always very connected with my sister and my brother. But when he moved out of our family home into an apartment in San Jose, he took those scrapbooks with him. And whenever I was visiting at his apartment or when I was at home before my parents' divorce, I would sit and just pore over those scrapbooks and try to talk to him about them. And he wouldn't really say much to me about that. I was a little girl. And again, I think he was kind of protecting the business, but it was just a source of fascination for me. And I'm so glad that he kept those. And it makes me so pleased to be able to share those with people who remember as children themselves, just watching him in action, or people who remember that era in wrestling. It's just so cool. And I appreciate, Brian, all the work that you do and the 605 and the people you have on and the historians. It's like, I'm so glad that these stories are still being told.
Well, Mary, I really appreciate the time you've given us today, and I'm very appreciative how much of your father's life and career you're sharing with us. As we wrap up this segment, how would you like to see your father remembered?
I'll say it in his own words, because about a year before he passed away, my father's memory was not as good as it had been when he was younger. And when he was sitting at my table, he had this moment of clarity, and he was speaking so clearly. And I'm so grateful, too. I just started recording him on my phone. And as he got ill in the last few months of his life, it gave me great peace to listen to his own words. And what he said about a year ago is he said that he felt like his life was nearing the end, and he spoke metaphorically, and he said, I feel like the curtain will be closing soon. And he said, everybody remembers me for my kind heart. And he said, everybody remembers me because I always did the best for people. And he said, I never let anybody down. He said, when I was supposed to be where I was supposed to be, I was there. And he said he always tried his best to help people, to have a kind heart, and to follow through and be responsible with his bookings and where he was supposed to be. And he said, I never let anybody down, the fans or the promoters or my family. So he had real peace about that. And that's how I have peace about him too, that apart from all of his wonderful accomplishments in wrestling, he just had an extraordinary life apart from that. And he was the best dad I could have asked for. And that's how I will always remember him, as not just Pampero Firpo, this fabulous, wonderful wrestler, which he was, but as my dad and all of the love that he showed me throughout my life.
We continue our look at Pampero Firpo here on the 605 Super Podcast this week by speaking about the Wild Bull of the Pampas with the son of Wild Bull Curry, a celebrated wrestler in his own right, Flying Fred Curry. Fred, thanks for being here today.
My pleasure.
Obviously, I know that you encountered Pampero Firpo during your career, specifically in Detroit, but if we could take a step back, because he came to Texas in, I believe, 1959, and your father was one of the biggest stars the state of Texas ever saw. Do you remember when you first heard about Pampero Firpo or saw Pampero Firpo?
Well, I did. I heard of him in reading the programs my dad used to send back to our home. But I mean, I first met Pampero personally when I was in the Detroit area in the early 60s on, and I was in Hawaii with him too. The guy, he never had any vices, I'm telling you. He was something else.
So, I mean, right there, we're talking about three different versions of him, because when your father would have first encountered him in Texas, he was Ivan the Terrible. When you would have seen him in Hawaii, he was the missing link. And of course, when he finally came to Detroit in 1972, he was Pampero Firpo. Let's talk about Hawaii a little bit. What do you remember about being there in Hawaii with him, where he was a major star?
Well, I'll tell you what I remember. In Hawaii it was really funny. We had an hour-and-a-half TV show. Half an hour was wrestling, an hour was talking. And nobody could talk better than Pampero Firpo. He'd have a little cup of tea, and he'd start talking, and he'd talk for about a half an hour. And everybody would be interested in what he had to say. He was, like, unique and sincere, and he just had a great voice. He had that gravel voice. Rah, rah. When I talked to him on the phone a few years back, I said, hey, Pampero, come on, give me that voice again. He'd give it. He was something else. But, I mean, he was perfect for Hawaii. In Detroit, he was the wild man. He was perfect. But here's a guy that I seen he never went to an after-hours party, and no one would dare say a cuss word in front of him. The guy's a sincere, straightforward, old-school type wrestler, no nonsense.
He would come to Detroit in 1972, at first as a heel on the side of the Sheik. Did he fit in right away? You were there. You were working in Detroit at that time. Did he fit in right away?
Fit in right away. Because his style was the only style that was there. You know, his voice, and he had a manager, and he was like the wild man of the Pampas. He was, I think he was Armenian, from Armenia, and he was a real gravel type, and he had hair all over his face. You couldn't see his eyes, shouting and yelling, and he'd be charging all the time. He was what you say, action makes reaction. He was an action guy in the ring. He'd always charge you, always come on you, always come toward you. You hit him, and he'd go back a little bit and be like a surprise. Hell, first time I ever wrestled him, I had to get the hell out of the ring because he started chasing me all over. He was something else, Pampero. Very respectful. I mean, like I said, nobody would say a cuss word in front of him. Never seen him at any after-hour parties. The guy was all business.
He was all business and all family, from what I've been told.
You're not kidding. You know, his daughter, Mary, I would talk to her a long time, and look for Pampero, and I'd get him to talk at his old voice again. But he was very respectful. You can see this guy was like from another country, another hemisphere. You know, he was not like the other wrestlers. You know, my dad was an old school type guy too. But I mean, these two guys, hey, they were no party goers. Never seen them chasing any women. Never seen them off-color jokes. They stayed to themselves, they'd relax and whatever. And then when you see them, they were kind of fun to be with. But you had to watch what you were saying. Couldn't say anything bad.
How did your father like working with him?
Yeah, he enjoyed them. You know, because that was my dad's style and his style. I mean, they kept on coming at you. And in fact, that style was old school style, and it drew a lot of money because, you know, it was really funny in those days. Coco Hall, Detroit was always sold out. The Maple Leaf Gardens was sold out. In California, when I was in the San Francisco area, you know, in Hawaii, and every place these guys sold out. They were believable. They were right down to the letter, and they were action guys, and they know how to talk and know how to transmit what they wanted to say to the people. But I tell you what, Pampero was perfect in Hawaii. Boy, he was perfect in Detroit.
I was going to say, where did he fit in better in your eyes, Detroit or Hawaii?
Yeah, both places. You know, he was an action-reaction in Detroit. He was an action-reaction in Hawaii. But Hawaii, there was more talking. Talk for an hour. And, I mean, he had, you know, all the big stars from the yesteryear were there. Magnificent Maurice and Johnny Barron, who was a Green Hornet. And all the big stars. And it was really funny. When we come back from Tokyo, we always stop in Hawaii. And Pampero, he was there. He spent a lot of time there. He spent a lot of time in Detroit. You know, this guy here, I never seen him at a party. I never seen him sending off-color jokes. I mean, when we went to the Cauliflower Alley Club Hall of Fame induction ceremonies, I always watch what I'm going to say in front of Pampero.
Do you remember, because you were in Detroit when he had his big babyface turn, where he was teaming with the Sheik and he accidentally got fireballed, and that led to Pampero Firpo, who had been a heel for the better part of 2 years in Detroit, turning babyface and going against the Sheik. Do you remember any of that?
Yeah, I remember a lot of it. You know, it's really funny listening to you. Seems like you were one of the boys. You talk about babyface heel and all that. So you're pretty familiar with the logging and talking. But Pampero, they didn't make any mistakes in Detroit at that time. At that heyday, from the 60s on to the mid-70s, they were packed the houses all the time. 72 was a banner year. But then, because we went all over. And Pampero was part of that because, yeah, we wrestled in Alaska, wrestled all through New York, Deanington, wrestled in southwestern part of the country in Arizona, Scottsdale, Albuquerque, New Mexico, all over that TV. That big time wrestling had went everywhere. And Firpo was a part of that. And he was perfect in Hawaii. Guy, he breaks me up on mine. I can see him right now. I mean, right in my head. You know, he's a guy you don't forget.
Well, we know what he sounded like on his promos. What did he sound like in the locker room? You said that you couldn't curse in front of him, but did his voice change once he was not on camera?
Very little. No, he wasn't shouting, but he had that gravel voice. I'll tell you what, he was a unique. Did you ever meet him?
I didn't, no.
Well, you would have liked that. I mean, he was, he wasn't shouting or, you know, in an angry type of mode. When he was on TV and all that, he was an angry type of mode. And this, he was just talking, but you could hear the gravelness in his voice and everything like that. But he was always very, very respectful of everybody around him. He was something else. Cuss in front of him. Yeah, you know, I always thought that guy was he might have been a priest because he just was a different type of guy.
Your father, of course, was of Lebanese descent, and Pampero Firpo was of Armenian descent, and
that's correct.
Various other people like the Sheik came from the Middle East. Did a lot of those guys stick together? Did they look out for each other?
They all stuck together because they all ate Arabic food and Armenian food, which encompassed grape leaves and all that type of spicy foods. I mean, these guys, it was like from the same area. It was the same venue. Everybody, that type of thing, you know, that's how people were over there, I guess. You know, wild and, you know, no nonsense type of guy. They're very serious. Pampero was a serious type guy. My dad was a serious. You know, I just remember, you know, speaking of, I was in a place with my dad in Detroit, and I seen one of these gangsters, which was very prevalent in the Detroit area. And because I know I seen this guy come in with long cigars, smoking pot, a cigarette smoking with a cigarette holder, guy who's in control of the guy, and they beat up on the guy. But he came over to my dad. I think he was trying to recruit him. My dad just looked at him glassy-eyed and never said a word to him. And the guy said, well, I'm either going to want to shake hands with you or run. He said, well, I think I'm just going to run. These guys were really gangsters because in that place I was in, these two guys, and that was one of them, came in there with this long cigarette smoking type of gangster. You go to the guy who was in control of the place. They did kiss and it was really right out of the movie. And they pulled this one guy off. They were teed off at him out of a chair and kicked him in the head. And it was something else. But going back to Pampero, like I said, he was a no-nonsense type of guy. He was straightforward. He was very respectful. He never was a party goer. Never seen him chasing women. And he was a real family man. And, you know, after talking to his daughter and being on the phone with him a long time, I just could feel all that type of he's always in control of what he was saying. And he was a heck of a good performer. Because, I mean, babyface, bad guy, or whatever he wanted to be, he could fit the part. You know, he always came at you. Action man. My type of guy. And he was, the big houses. I look at these houses they have nowadays. They were no comparison. We were before houses with thousands and thousands of people, 25,000, 15. It was like Madison Square Garden bell everywhere we went. And that was the way these guys worked. These guys were hard-nosed, all business, no screwing around type of individuals. And very respectful.
I am happy to welcome to the Super Podcast and say aloha to Bill Atkinson in Hawaii, and we're going to talk about Pampero Firpo, or as he was known in Hawaii, the Missing Link, and the time he spent down in Hawaii. Bill, thanks for being here today.
Okay, nice talking to you.
What can you tell me about how the Missing Link first got to Hawaii? Obviously, he had been wrestling in various different places under various different names. He was Ivan the Terrible in Texas. He became Pampero Firpo. And then he would come to Hawaii and get an all-new persona. What can you tell me about how he first got there?
Okay, he first got here on April 6, 1966 at a Civic Auditorium card. He teamed with Handsome Johnny Moran and Ripper Collins in a six-man tag team match. And what happened is he was a bad guy. And he actually, on that same card, he wrestled Chief Jay Strumbo. He went under the name Joe Scarpia.
Yeah, his real name.
Yeah, he wrestled under that name. He wrestled twice that night. And anyway, he was a bad guy, and apparently he came to the rescue of Nep Mayava, and he he helped him out, and this infuriated Brandon Collins, and they had a series of grudge matches throughout all the way to June 29, 1966, when Johnny Moran defended his U.S. title against the Missing Link in a match at the Honolulu National Center. From what I heard, that he was injured in that match, and he spent 29 days at the Queen's Hospital in Hawaii. He wrestled in trunks. When he came back, he had a big scar on him. He covered it up with the current outfit that he wore through the rest of his career. He had a series of grudge matches with Moran and Collins, and then he wrestled all the way until early 67, and then he left, and then he came back in 1968 as a good guy. He came back in 68, and that's when I started watching him.
Just to give a little bit of the background and a little bit of the history here, obviously some of the names you mentioned are known, like Handsome Johnny Barend is someone who was a star here in the States and then became an even bigger star in Hawaii. When it comes to Johnny Barend and Ripper Collins, do they rank really high on the list of all-time Hawaiian wrestling greats?
Johnny Barend does for his wrestling, Ripper Collins, because he did crazy interviews and so did everybody, mispronounced the Hawaiian language. So he was just the notorious villain that all the locals over here hated.
In terms of the TV, obviously there isn't much, if any, footage that still exists to this day. Describe for me, if you can, I know you started watching in 68, what the TV was like. Was it matches in a studio? Was it interviews? How long were the interviews? Describe Hawaiian wrestling TV for me.
Okay, they had two shows. One was called Wrestling from the Civic or Wrestling from the Honolulu National Center. Wrestling was held at the Civic Auditorium downtown Honolulu, and then had a new arena called the Honolulu National Center. So they would tape two matches, and they would squeeze interviews in between them, and then they would air them on Friday nights at 10 o'clock or 10:30 after the news. And it was called Wrestling from the Civic or the Honolulu National Center. And you would watch these matches. And then they squeezed interviews. They had two matches. They played one match, and they had the locker room interviews, which ran it was a 90-minute show. And the interviews would run maybe 30 minutes. And they used it to promote the upcoming card every Wednesday they held in Honolulu. And then the Saturday show was a live show they held at the KGMB studio. And that opened up. It was called 50th State Wrestling. It opened up, and they would have a segment called Demonstrations. And most of it was done by the good guy wrestlers. They would demonstrate wrestling holds. and then they would have a studio match, and then they would do the locker room interviews, and they would go back and have a last studio match, and then it ended. I attended several of the studio shows. It was called KGMB Studio, and that was the name of the show, 50th State Wrestling.
In terms of television in Hawaii during this period of time, the mid-'60s, the late '60s, can you please describe for the listeners, how many channels were there? When something like 50th State Wrestling aired, did a lot of people watch it? What was the competition? What was television like in Hawaii during this period of time?
Well, back then we had no satellite, hardly any live sports from the mainland. Most of the shows were tape delayed. The sporting events, they would air the next day or later that night. They would fly the films in from Los Angeles. So basically on a Saturday afternoon, on Friday night, there was no late night programming. Maybe they would have late night movies on the other shows. On Saturday, I know they would have either movies or just reruns of other TV shows on the other two channels. There's channel 2, 4, 9, which aired the wrestling. Channel 13, which was an independent station. And just to let you know, wrestling started on channel 4, and then it's described in the book 50th State Wrestling. Then they didn't want to do a long-time contract, and they switched over to KGMB in '67. So basically, you didn't have much to watch back then.
So a lot of people were watching that wrestling show, and again, like you said, it wasn't just matches. You had about a half hour of interviews. Those interviews and those personalities, how big was that? How much did that connect? When you were first getting into wrestling in 1968, and you would see someone like the Missing Link, Pampero Firpo, doing an interview, did it immediately connect with you? Did it connect with the other kids you grew up with? How big was it amongst the youth in Hawaii?
Okay, the Missing Link was really popular. I remember in kids, a lot of guys would go, oh yeah, kids in school on the playground. And then myself, I was more attracted to the bad guys like Ripper Collins, Johnny Moran, because I liked that crazy talk they did. I was never really a good guy fan. But the Missing Link, you could actually back then walk up to the wrestlers. You can get their autographs right there at the back of the arena. And they were really accessible, really friendly to the public. By the way, I want to let you know something, that the Missing Link, because I do have a lot of audio recordings, was so popular, he actually did commercials for KGMB TV. He actually did a newscast doing the weather of the Missing Link.
Get out of here.
Yeah, because I have I have a lot of audio recordings from November '67 through June '68, and I when I first got him, I was listening to him fanatically. And there's one where he did the Friday night news preceding the 50th State Wrestling TV show. That was, the Wrestling from the Civic TV show airing that night.
When you first got interested and started watching, and the Missing Link had come back to Hawaii, how was he presented? Was he presented as a returning legend? Was he presented as someone who, obviously he had a background, he had come in originally as a bad guy, had become a good guy, and then quickly got injured? How was he presented when he returned in '68?
When he came back on January 10th, 1968. If you go to my website, it has the return of the Missing Link. And he teamed with Neff Mayava and Jim Haiti. And they battled Killer Kowalski, Angelo Poffo, and Kinji Shibuya in a 6-man tag match. And when he came back, he was a good guy. What happened is that Johnny Baran and Jim Haiti were the Hawaiian Tag Team Champions, and they split. Johnny Baran, for a brief period, was a good guy. They split, and each of them had each part of the title. Each half had one half of the Hawaiian Tag Team title. And so Baran, he went back to Johnny Baran. So what happened is Jim Haiti picked the Missing Link as his tag team partner. And they rived that promotion up all the way to a match that was where Ripper Collins had a trophy that was an old trophy, was the Hawaiian Tag Team Champions from the Al Karasik days, where Jim Haiti and the Missing Link had the tag belts. And they had a match in 1968. It was held on February 21st, 1968. I have photos up of it on my website under the classic matches. And then the premises of the match was if Johnny Baran and Ripper Collins lost, Haiti and the Missing Link would destroy the trophy. And the other side of the coin was if Baran and Collins lost, they would cut up the belts. And it just so happened that Haiti and the Missing Link defeated Baran and Collins 2 straight falls during that match.
What can you tell the listeners about Jim Haiti? Because I know that the Missing Link was close with him, and of course, he would meet a tragic end. Let the listeners know a little bit of his background.
When I first started out, Jim Haiti was really popular. He was a good guy. At the time, when I first started seeing him, he was a popular wrestler on the 50th State Big Time Wrestling Show. The 50th State, they called it 50th State Wrestling. When it first opened up, Jim Haiti would always do these demonstrations for the first maybe 15 minutes of the show, showing fans wrestling moves. And then, basically he became, he wrestled with the Missing Link. They lost their titles to Ripper Collins and Curtis the Bull. And shortly after that, Jim Haiti, he won the Hawaiian title from Johnny Baran. And then they changed it to the North American title. He lost his title to Professor Tanaka on Christmas Day, 68, and supposedly he broke his hand. He hit his hand on the rope, and he couldn't wrestle for a few weeks. And then when he went back to wrestle at Schofield Barracks, he was in a six-man tag, and he said he wasn't feeling well, and he went home. He collapsed and died. How I heard about it was when I went to Nimitz Elementary School the next day. That's all everybody talked about on the bus and in school, that Jim Haiti died. And he was really popular over here. The news ran reports on him. I actually attended a memorial show at the Civic Auditorium where all the wrestlers came out and paid tribute to him. But if you mention Jim Haiti's name to a lot of people, he was very popular. He was accessible. The fans for autographs. He spoke very well. He was one of the few, over here, white guys are called Howleys. I'm one of them. But he was one of the most popular Howley wrestlers that ever wrestled in Hawaii. He was the one everybody liked.
And that tribute show was to raise money for his widow, correct?
Right. It was all benefits will go to, I remember the clipping said all benefits will go to Mrs. Haiti. And I remember it was all the wrestlers came out that night. Everybody stood up. They rang the bell 10 times. And after that, the wrestling match started. I remember even Ripper Collins, who hated Jim Haiti, went on there and actually paid a nice tribute to him on the interviews. That's what I always remember, because instead of Ripper Collins trashing the good guys, he played a nice tribute to Jim Haiti.
You mentioned that you started attending shows in 1968. What was the makeup of the crowd in terms of, was it a wild crowd? Was it a crowd that rioted often at that point in time and in the late 60s? What was it like to attend a show in Honolulu?
The first matches I used to go to were at this arena called Block Arena, which is right outside of Pearl Harbor. They would hold wrestling every other Sunday there. And basically it was mainly all military people, dependents and military people. Actually a very peaceful crowd. When I went to the Civic Auditorium, the first match I attended was in July 68. It was Ripper Collins against Curtis the Bull in a grudge match. The crowd was more rowdier. In fact, speaking of riots, if you go to April 3rd, 1968 on my website in the classic matches, there was a riot at the Civic Auditorium where Peter Maivia and Neff Maiava were beat up by Curtis the Bull and Johnny Baran, and the fans rioted.
And the Missing Link was on that show.
Yeah, he battled Ripper Collins. That was his arch enemy in Hawaii.
Was it more Ripper Collins than Johnny Baran as the arch enemy for the Missing Link?
Yes. Because Ripper Collins would always tease him about the scar he had on his stomach when he switched from the trunks to that current wrestling outfit they had to strap around his shoulder. He would always humiliate the Missing Link. And one match I remember I never went to, but it was promoted. It was a match between Ripper Collins and Pampero Firpo, and the loser would get his head shaved in the ring. And Ripper Collins lost. They shaved his head and he started wearing a mask. But from that on moment, they always had feuds. It was always a Missing Link. They had feuds over the years, and Ripper Collins was his number one enemy in Hawaii.
What was the actual injury in the match with Johnny Baran in 1966? Do you know?
Well, from what I heard as a kid, he injured his spleen. He got slammed into the pole, and Baran and Collins attacked him. They kept stomping on him. And I just heard this from wrestling fans because I wasn't watching the time, that he had broke his spleen and he spent the time in the hospital. If you go, I have it on the history, on the wrestler section. He spent, I think, over a month in the Queen's Hospital. Then he came back for a series of grudge matches against Baran and Collins. And I heard it was a spleen injury. He had a gigantic scar, a couple of scars, and he switched to that current outfit he wore because it covered the scars.
After 68, when did he come back to Hawaii?
He came back in January 68 as a tag team partner of Neff Maeva, and Jim 80, January 68. He stayed basically to the middle of the year. He left again. Then he came back in a 6-man tag team match. They listed him as a mystery wrestler. They didn't know who it was. And then he came out in that tag team match as the last guy out and was a missing link, and the whole crowd went nuts.
You know, we're talking a little bit about these shows that you attended, and obviously you were on Oahu. But for the promotion, for 50th State Wrestling, what was the rest of the schedule like? Were they doing many shows in Maui, or was there anything in Kauai? Were there shows on the other side of the island? What was a typical schedule like for the promotion?
Okay, how it was is they had the Sunday show. You start off the first day of the week. Sunday would either wrestle at Schofield Barracks, an Army base, or they would go to Block Arena, Pearl Harbor. Then on Wednesday, they would have their weekly card. And then once a month, they would go to the Outer Islands. It's usually Monday and Tuesday. Monday was Hilo, and Tuesday was Maui. And then occasionally, they would go to Kauai or Molokai to wrestle. That's how their schedule was. It was once a month to the Outer Islands. I think in the summer, they increased it to maybe 2 times a month going to the Outer Islands.
After Pampero Firpo, the missing link, leaves in June of 1968, when does he return again? Well, you said he returned for the Battle Royal. After the Battle Royal, is he there as a regular for a while, or what's his schedule like in Hawaii at that point in time?
Okay, let me correct that. He returned in a 6-man tag team match in August 1969 as a mystery partner. I think it was of Nick Bockwinkel and Dory Dixon in a 6-man tag. He came back as a good guy. The reason I mentioned the Battle Royal, that was later. Curtis the Bull held the Hawaiian tag team title with Ripper Collins. He held the Hawaiian championship, and he held the they call it the North American title at the time. It was a U.S. title. They switched it to the North American title. So he gave up his Hawaiian title match, and then they had a battle royal that the winner would be declared the Hawaiian champion. The missing link won that. That was in October '69. So he came back as a 6-man tag team match. He was super popular. He lasted all the way to February 1970. He left again. Then he later returned in 1978 or 77 when Ed Francis restarted his promotion with weekly cards at Block Arena.
When was the Battle Royal where he came back as the surprise entrant?
He actually came back earlier, about 2 months earlier in August '69. They had named him as a mystery wrestler in a 6-man tag. That Hawaiian title, the Battle Royal, was later. He did enter as the name of Pampero Firpo. He won the Hawaiian championship by being the last man in the ring. October 8, 1969, the missing link won the Texas Battle Royal, just becoming the Hawaiian champion. He returned in a few months earlier as a mystery wrestler in a 6-man tag team match. When he came out, the whole crowd went nuts. I was there. Everybody was wanting to know who is it going to be. You didn't know. You didn't know. I was actually in the crowd because it was in the summer. That's when I started. I was at the Civic Cards, and everybody's wondering, wow, who is this guy? And all of a sudden, he came out of the locker room, and there was a missing link. He did his own roar, and the whole crowd went nuts at the Civic Auditorium.
After this period of time, the beginning of 1970, he would leave for the mainland, and he wouldn't return for a long time, and obviously there are a lot of changes that would happen in Hawaiian wrestling. What was the state of affairs when he would return in 1977? How different was it than it had been in the 1960s?
Okay. In the 1960s, they had an arena that held 5,000 people. It's called the Civic Auditorium. In 1972, they stopped holding weekly wrestling shows there, so Ed Francis switched to monthly wrestling shows. And then it went all the way up to 74. Then he stopped promoting wrestling. He brought it back in 1977. But what he did is he promoted weekly cards at Block Arena. And so once a month went to the Honolulu National Center that was renamed the Blaisdell Arena after a Honolulu mayor that okayed the funding for the arena. So basically they held weekly cards instead of being downtown. The wrestling show wasn't live anymore. It was a tape show called Wrestling Hawaii. It was taped. The matches were taped at Block Arena or the Blaisdell Arena. It was a 1-hour show instead of a 90-minute show. The interviews were shorter. They had 2 matches in between. Basically, that was the difference between the promotion. Just the arenas changed. when they brought back Billy White Wolf, the Missing Link. Francis's sons were wrestling, and they would bring old timers back, but basically they had new wrestlers, and the TV promotions were shorter. And it was on Friday night at 10 o'clock called Wrestling Hawaii.
Did the fans remember the Missing Link well when he returned?
I was not there at the time. I was in the military. When I came back, I'd take my leave over here, and I remember I went there. He wasn't there the first. He actually came back. When I first walked in the arena, he was outside talking to some people. You know, he was still popular. It wasn't like the old days when everyone would go, "Oh yeah," when he walked out. The wrestlers weren't really accessible for autographs back then. It was more like it was a different time as far as, you know, you had satellite TV, outside sports. It just wasn't as popular. I would go to the arena. It wasn't as full like the HIC, the Civic, or the Sunday Block Arena shows that were just packed. I guess the crowds died down. It was just a different time.
And it's shortly after that where Pampero Firpo, the Missing Link, would leave Hawaii for the last time and his career would start winding down.
Actually, he did come back when Peter Maivia bought the promotion.
Oh.
He came back in the summer of 1980. And he wrestled. In fact, if you go to YouTube, there was a battle royal that he was in with as Pampero Firpo under the Peter Maivia promotions.
Bill, I really appreciate the time you're giving us today and also the history lesson into Hawaiian wrestling, 50th State Wrestling. Looking back on the Missing Link, what is the legacy he leaves behind in Hawaii?
He was super popular among fans. Everybody remembered the "oh yeah," that was the signature thing that most people mentioned. In fact, when he passed away the other day, I told a lot of older people about it, and they were like, "Oh yeah, I remember the Missing Link." He was real popular for a lot of kids growing up because he was a popular wrestler. He was a good guy. His "oh yeah" signature made him popular. He was a popular wrestler.
You just heard my conversation with Hawaiian wrestling historian Bill Atkinson. Of course, Bill has a fantastic website that everyone should check out, 50th State, BigTimeWrestling.com. And on this website, there are results, photos, descriptions of the wrestlers, descriptions of some of the angles and feuds that took place, and much, much more. He really did a fantastic job, and I encourage everyone out there with any interest in wrestling history to check out 50th State BigTimeWrestling.com. And of course, the audio from Hawaii was supplied by Bill here today, and we're very, very grateful and very thankful, and he's officially a friend of the show. And let's now hear some audio from April 6th, 1968. We're going to hear some audio of the opening moments and the closing moments of The Missing Link, Pampero Firpo, versus Jerry London, as well as an interview with Ed Francis that is taking place on the birthday of Pampero Firpo. He was born on April 6th. This interview is on April 6th, and the news that it's his birthday causes Ripper Collins to have a few words. So you'll hear a little bit of Ripper Collins, one of the other legendary wrestlers from the heyday of 50th State Wrestling. Let's go to this audio right now.
Sports fan fall with a 15-minute time limit. Introducing first in the blue corner, making his first appearance on 50th State Big Time Wrestling, Jerry London. Jerry London. His opponent this afternoon, he needs no introduction. He's from Argentina. The Wild Bull of the Pampas, the Missing Link. The Missing Link. Referee Walton Katsumi, timekeeper Duck Rodriguez, chief second, the Portuguese Flash Nolan Rodriguez. I believe it's the time limit. Yes. 15 minutes run out. No wrestler score to fall. So Pampero attempts to shake hands with Jerry London. It's a draw. He's still in the ring. Okay. Okay, sports fans in the locker with promoter Ed Francis in just a moment, following this important message. Number one in Honolulu, Hawaii.
Pampero Firpo. Come on, Pampero. Hiya. You should be smiling too, because you and Haiti are going to be wrestling Johnny Barand and Curtis Yaokia this coming Wednesday at the Civic.
Yes, we will meet these two fellows, and of course, This time we will not be on the stage, our championship match. But believe me, it's not because I'm ducking. We are not ducking to them for the belt. The only thing is this. These persons here, Ed Francis, think they will be easy to get my good partner, Jim Addy, and myself in the ring, like you snap your fingers. Took us many nights and many days of training and secret conference to get a successful win for that belt, and we will remain as a champion, let's go say it in the most humble way, as long our good luck help us. I know. I'm so happy, so thrilled nowadays. Even I forget to speak a common and regular English. Already my English is very broke, and now I'm so excited that, well, you see, today is a very, very unusual day for me too, and that is one of the reasons why I'm so happy. I received many, many letters, and today I'm 1 year old, younger.
Today you're 1 year younger. You mean today's your birthday?
Uh-huh. No. Congratulations. That is one of the reasons why I'm so happy, so thrilled, because you have to see my biggest present was all these children outside surrounding me and hugging me and giving me kisses and giving me lace and autograph, asking for and shaking hands and hugging and say, oh, I'm telling you, I'm all mixed up and I don't drink. Hey, listen, isn't a consequence of any liquor or nothing like that, because I don't drink.
Nothing like that vodka that I have once in a while.
Well, each individual have his own habit, but mine, the only white liquid I drink is just milk.
Okay, well, listen, good luck in your match next week.
Thank you, Ed, and once again, thank you, Kikis. Thank you, all of you, wrestling fans of the 50th state, and once again, my good partner, gentleman Jim Addy, and myself, we will do our best in the ring to satisfy all of you. Tofa.
Well, let's get Ripper Collins out.
Birthday time in the locker room. All the kickets are shaking his hand and giving him kisses on his birthday. He must have run ahead in the advertiser stating that today was his birthday. I got 2 kids at home, got something for you, Link. One carries a hammer and the other one got a pair of flowers, buddy. Happy birthday. Are you ready for that? There's a guy says don't drink anything stronger than milk. Left his trunks at home today and had to borrow a pair. Tell me he's on straight milk.
The next bit of audio we're going to hear is from May 10th, 1968. It's an interview with The Missing Link, as well as Peter Maivia and Nef Mayava. They are getting ready on May 15th to go up against Handsome Johnny Berend, Ripper Collins, and King Curtis Ayukea. There's a confrontation here with Ripper Collins, which apparently leads to our 3 heroes, Nef Mayava, Peter Maivia, and The Missing Link, breaking boards over their heads. Let's go to this audio right now.
Well, let's bring The Missing Link and Peter Maivia, Nef Mayava, bring all them out here and see what they have to say.
Remember about Chicago! 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 What you try to prove? You can impress us? Yes. The only thing we'll change is the city. It will be Honolulu. The rules will be the same. I know, and my partners know what kind of dangerous match we are facing in this elimination tag team. We are sick and tired of being called names, hippies, bushy faces, etc., etc., etc. We are tired, and we have a plan. Yes, we have made a plan, and we will use it next Wednesday.
Hello, Mr. Francis. They're always calling us the Link, the Lunk, and the Monk. But we're going to show them this week that we're not, and we're 3 aheads over here. We've got some boys here to to see that we're in shape. Our heads all together, the three of us. We'll help us.
Somebody's always knocking down walls and everything in here.
Well, that's nothing.
What we talking about knocking people down. I think Mr. Link will go and show this how to break a boat.
We have to show or prove anything. The people know how strong is our head now. Wait, we have to show them.
Show them.
Okay.
Who's going to show what? Who's going to do what?
Link is going to break the board.
Pampero's going to break it?
We're fist, huh? No. And you can
What's the matter with Joe?
Come on, Link.
Well, you can do it, Link. Come on, Link. Never mind that guy over there. We'll get his chances.
Take it easy. Hold it up. Holy smokes. Hey,
Once for all and all for one.
Holy smokes. All these boards, they broke up all the boards against two of them were 2-inch boards. I can't believe it. Collins, if you can wade through all this lumber, if you want to be on this locker room interview.
At the top of the show, we played a little bit of audio, something that viewers of 50th State Wrestling heard each week when they watched. Pampero Firpo kicking off the show, and of course, it's that clip that Lanny Poffo has cited as being the specific clip that influenced Randy Macho Man Savage to adopt "ooh yeah" as his expression. Much better than I just did right there, by the way. But when Ed Francis and Lord James Blears came back in the late 70s to promote, once again, the Missing Link was on TV doing an intro. We heard it from 1968 at the top of the show. Let's hear what it sounded like in 1978.
You are watching KGMB, the best television station in Hawaii. Telephone 9. Oh, yeah.
I am happy to welcome back to the Super Podcast today a friend of the show to continue our look at Pampero Firpo, all the way from Tokyo, Japan, Fumi Saito. Fumi, thanks for being here today.
Hello, how are you?
Well, we're here to talk about Pampero Firpo, and obviously there is a legacy with Pampero Firpo in Japan. When did he first come to Japan?
1967. 1967. Yeah, it was. Yeah, we have to point out that it was before a lot of wrestlers have multiple tour within a frame of 1 year. It was an era where American wrestler would tour maybe twice or three times in lifetime. You know what I'm saying?
These are the JWA years, so this is early on in the history of Japanese wrestling.
Yeah, the only American wrestlers who toured multiple times in 1 year frame was Dick Bayer, Destroyer, and Freddie Blassie. And most wrestlers just came once or twice in their lifetime. Unlike Bruiser Brody or Stan Hansen having 10 tours a year for a 15-year period or something like that, or the Funks come in 6-7 times a year, not like that. Then it was like it was always very special to have new American wrestlers, stars, come and do a serious tour. And Pampero Firpo's initial tours, 1967, 9th annual World League Tour. You know, the tournament Ricky Dozan was designing. And this was 2 years after, wait a minute, it was like 4 years after Ricky Dozan's passing, but they remained this World League Tour every spring, this, round-robin tournament. Not quite round-robin tournament because Japanese didn't fight against one another. It was American against foreigners, basic format was, And this 9th annual World League Tour, tournament had people like the Destroyer, Waldo von Erich, Butcher Vachon, Dan Miller, and aged Mike DiBiase, and 2 more Americans, I don't know who they really are, but the George Harris and Ox Anderson, if that ring a bell.
Yeah, George Bunk Harris, yeah.
Okay, George Harris and Ox Anderson. And Pampero Firpo was like a 4th from the top, underneath the Destroyer and Waldo von Erich and Butcher Vachon. But when you hear Waldo von Erich and Butcher Vachon and Dan Miller, it's like it's all younger brother of somebody famous or something. But you know what I'm saying?
Right.
Yeah. But this was Pampero Firpo's very first tour. And Mr. Moto from California and Duke Kemuka from Florida came in too. That was his very first tour, April to May, 1 month period.
At this period of time, how familiar would the Japanese fans have been? Was there coverage in the magazines? Obviously, it's a reading culture. Was there coverage in the magazines of Firpo in Los Angeles or the AWA?
And every year when they had this World League, tournament thing, it's the biggest tour of the year. And every April, these participants from America, or they say all over the world, very featured in magazines. So people, wrestling fan would know who they are before, they came in. Because Destroyer, Dick Bayer had 6 or 7 tours before this one. But for case of Waldo von Erich and Butcher Vachon and Dan Miller and Pampero Firpo, or even aged Mike DiBiase, it was their first tour. So we had to read about it. And I read Pampero Firpo was fluent in five languages. Is that true? And he's a very intelligent person. In spite of the fact that he looked like that, the hair and, beard and, iron bending thing and, all those things. Yeah. Wild guy.
How did that tour go?
The winner of this 9th annual World League Tour tournament was Giant Baba beating the Destroyer in the final. Yeah.
So obviously, Mike DiBiase, Pampero Firpo, the Destroyer, you have some regulars there from Los Angeles in 67.
Okay.
Was Mr. Moto the one who booked everyone onto the tour?
Yeah. But having Duke Kemuka, that attending this tour all through the tour, I can see the Florida influence on it too. But these two are cousins,
Yeah.
This was after, they basically kicked out Great Togo from the booking position, and Mr. Moto took over the job, and it was more California-oriented. Everything was.
Did Firpo get over strong in 67? Because like you said, guys usually didn't get multiple tours, and he would come back in 68. How did he get over on that first tour?
Oh, probably because of this, the wild look and, very unusual, thing. And being on television match was pretty important, I think, because it was still once a week and prime time, network channel, of course, but it was, long before cable TV or anything else. And once a week, 8 o'clock, Friday night, people sit home and watch your network television and 1 hour live coverage of professional wrestling. And basically it's Giant Baba time, right? Giant Baba hour. And who Baba will be fighting this week. And so it was, Pampero Firpo wasn't exactly the biggest star of this tour, but he did have coverage. Let's put it that way.
And he got in the ring with Inoki. Inoki defeated him on that tour.
Yeah, Inoki was becoming a star then. Yeah, was already a star, but Baba was clearly number one. Yeah.
Out of all of those guys, Firpo's look really stood out. In terms of the Japanese magazines and the newspaper coverage of wrestling, were a lot of images of Pampero Firpo in the media at that period of time?
Tokyo Sports, because they used to have this Haneda Airport press conference, as they are. I think they didn't take different flight into Japan. They pretty much met up in Los Angeles and took the same airplane into Japan. So they all come in on the same plane and have press conference right at the airport as upon their arrival. Pretty good one, huh?
Yeah.
And so they treat it like a big deal, because all these wrestler participants from all over the world, just coming to Haneda Airport, and they're all just getting off the airplane and have a press conference right there. And the next morning, the sports tabloid, the sports paper, Tokyo Sports, Nikkan Sports, and such, they cover that. So it's pretty big, like a sports news back then. Bigger than now.
What can you tell me about his next tour, which was the summer of 1968? And
right, you got you did the research. This was really unique too, unique member too. They only had 5 Americans. It's a summer series called August to September, 1 month, series. We call it series. It's a tour. Summer of 1968. That the guys, Pampero Firpo came with, they were very interesting, very crew too. He came in with Haystack Calhoun. He came in with Luke Graham, Mom Mountain Cannon, and the only skinny one was Bob Armstrong.
The only skinny one.
Yeah, I guess, the normal looking person.
Yeah.
Haystack Calhoun was a star of the tour. Luke Graham, of course, Crazy Luke Graham. And Mom Mountain Cannon, another guy who's overall, pretty much, this one's from Detroit, right? But he's big, fat guy. Yeah. And Pampero Firpo. So they had this certain color, certain characteristic on this tour. Summer series, so it was like, I guess it's a summertime that a lot of kids, more kids in the audience than in adult-oriented days of wrestling. And that's my take on this. This summer tour needed to have somebody more, I don't know, like kids were like,
And did the kids like Pampero Firpo?
Back then, we have to realize, 1968, wrestlers are like viewed pretty far away than somebody you can touch, I mean, today's star, or even the 80s and 90s star, you can come up and almost touch, or you can meet them, if you waited long enough at the hotel lobby or something. But back then, 1960s wrestlers, especially American wrestlers, are scary, scary people.
Did anyone else on this tour already come to Japan? Did Haystacks Calhoun, had he already been to Japan?
Yeah. Haystacks Calhoun was here before. Luke Graham wasn't. Mom Mountain Cannon wasn't. This was Bob Armstrong's first tour too. So Pampero Firpo was the only second one. Haystack Calhoun and Pampero Firpo pretty much headlined the tour.
So what does it say about Firpo that he did get a second tour so quickly after his first one?
Wow. People must have, liked him, I guess. Yeah. Didn't look at it that way. But, right, like I said, American superstars didn't have that, frequent tours, didn't come too often, right? So company must have liked it, or the Mr. Moto thought he had a good, reception, or, very much following, 1 year later, not even one full year. It's like, well, bring him back next summer or something. This is what they said, right? So, very interesting. I never thought about it, But this crew of Haystack Calhoun and Crazy Luke Graham and Mom Mountain Cannon, Pampero Firpo, and just a bunch of just unusual looking people,
Firpo would return again in 1970, another real world.
World's Big League Series, 12th annual. This had this loaded members. You got Don Leo Jonathan, young and good Chris Markoff, Tarzan Tyler, and the attraction was the convict, the Stan Fraser. But the convict character was really, really big. I'll tell you in a minute. And they had Dutch Savage, Nelson Royal, Paul Jones, and Mr. Moto was, with them too. And Don Leo Jonathan, very serious, like former world heavyweight champion type, And the attraction for kids was actually the convict, because there was a comic book about wrestling, and he had the one chapter on the convict came from Sing Sing, the prison, and in the magazine put this big picture that he beat Bobo Brazil, and that the convict had the whole chapter. He appeared on comic book Tiger Mask too, and also animation Tiger Mask had convict in it too. And the convict was pretty big. The attraction on this tour. Unfortunate for Pampero Firpo on this tour was though he acted as the convict's manager, sort of more so than headline star,
I've seen some of the pictures of them in Japan together.
Yeah.
And he's acting as the manager, but beyond those photos, what does that mean? Did he escort him to the ring? Did he do promos in the newspaper?
Put the chain on his neck and pulling him, or convict is gonna walk into crowd and all that, start hurting people and all those things. So it's odd enough that the guy looking like Pampero Firpo, crazy looking guy, but kind of short, right? He is pulling the big chain, and he's the only one who can talk to calm down the convict. And he was well used as a manager, but that took his serious, competitor's image away from him, sort of. You know what I'm saying?
And because of that, he didn't have a lot of wins on this tour. Looking at
not this tour, because Don Leo Jonathan, of course, was the headliner of this card. And Chris Markoff was a second place winner from the previous year. The year before that, 1969's World Series, the final was Antonio Inoki against Chris Markoff, Giant Baba against Bobo Brazil, and four guys on top and on the same point. And Baba and Brazil drew, and so it's like they were eliminated. So the real final match was Inoki against Chris Markoff, and Inoki won. 26-year-old Antonio Inoki won the World League Series for the first time. That was the previous year. In 1970, Baba has to win again, and now you have people like Don Leo Jonathan and Tarzan Tyler, the convict, that's Savage, pretty big, and Nelson Royal, Paul Jones. They're all good too. And Pampero Firpo pretty much took this managerial role, during this tour. So it was kind of unfortunate for him on, this time. But he was already 40 too,
I remember there's an issue of Gong magazine I have from this year. It's a pretty memorable image. It's just the convict's face with that mask.
Right. Because he was attraction, after this comic book and the animation and Tiger Mask thing. And he was like, I was young enough to really thinking that convict is going to win this tournament. No, not that. But, and also, I remember that the convict guy would not answer the interview, right? So you have to have Pampero Firpo sit with him and he will answer all the questions. That was how it was.
In the comic book or in the animation, did the convict have someone to speak for him, or was that just for the wrestling?
The press, wrestling, yeah. But Pampero Firpo's image appeared in the comic book too, as a manager. I'm gonna go. Yeah, I have all the back copy of this comic book. So I gotta dig through that. Yeah, but I think there was an image of him in Japanese comic book. It's kind of good. Yeah, but he appeared in 9th Annual World League in Summer Series. 1970, he appeared in very serious Spring World Big League tournament thing. So all these tours he appeared was pretty important tours.
And it would be 10 years before he would return.
10 years. Yeah, 1980 in another summer tour, July tour. It's summer action series. He was probably 50 by then. Yeah. And this 10 years gone by, and the face of superstar wrestlers changed drastically. It was Bruiser Brody tour, Bruiser Brody was on it. A little bit aged, but still good. Ernie Ladd was in it. Very young David David San Martino was in it. Dominic DeNucci was in it. And then in the brother tag team, Rick Davidson and John Davidson, the long hair, biker type. I think these brothers are from Detroit.
Yeah.
Rick Dixon and John Davison, David San Martino young, and Dominic DeNucci probably as a babysitter, I think. But the Bruiser Brody and Ernie Ladd on this tour, and aged Pampero Firpo had this farewell, like a final tour. I think it's pretty symbolic, you know?
Well, tell me a little bit about it, because obviously this is not just 10 years later. This is a different company. This is All Japan Pro Wrestling,
All
Giant
Japan,
Baba's company.
Right. Yeah, but it was Baba is like a direct ancestor of big, JWA, because the old JWA company didn't even last 1 year after Baba left, you know? Giant Baba took Channel 4 network channel and the TV show with him when he left. And JWA could not survive without television. And they were trying to make Seiji Sakaguchi as top guy. And Sakaguchi and Inoki had this, secret meeting, and he decided to go with Inoki the following spring. And All Japan was very direct lineage of old JWA, company. And Baba pretty much took over. And the old, bosses had to leave, sort of like, like Yoshino Sato and those people. Well, that was time for them to go. And Channel 4 and All Japan pretty much took over the old company. Not just the structure, but pretty much the image of Channel 4 pro wrestling television show. And they had Saturday night, 8 o'clock, 1 hour show for a long time. But by 1980, TV show was Saturday afternoon, 4:30. Saturday afternoon, 4:30. So somewhat it was not as good as 8 o'clock, but it was still on network channel. And Bruiser Brody in 1980 was still pretty young, not that young, but it was like a fourth year in business. And but Baba was already using Bruiser Brody as a headliner for this company. And I think Pampero Firpo had influence on Bruiser Brody, not just the hair and the costume, and stuff, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The mannerism and the way he carried himself, and the believable, like a craziness, and also the type of veteran that the Bruiser Brody would respect and listen to. The Bruiser Brody had a few teachers, but only a few people like Fritz von Erich, King Curtis, and Pampero Firpo, would have been another one.
They teamed up a couple of times on this tour, or a few times,
and
actually.
Tour Japan for 1 full month, and being in the dressing room every night together. People was, Bruiser Brody, Ernie Ladd was in the dressing room, and Pampero Firpo in the dressing room. What would they be talking, in the afternoon? So I just imagined that. I wasn't there, but in the dressing room. But those people would be sitting in the same dressing room for 1 full month, night after night after night after night. So they had to be talking, So that was like, it must have had, he must have had this big influence in Bruiser Brody's character structuring and sort of like attitude building. And developing the believability and how to relate to the world, how to relate to the media, especially in Japan. Yeah, all those things.
How many tours had Bruiser Brody already done here in 1980?
Up until this point, this was his third tour.
Okay, so he's still relatively new.
Yeah. But Baba started using him as headliner upon his arrival that year before, 1979. He came in with Fritz von Erich. And Fritz von Erich left after 1 week, and Bruiser Brody stayed in the remainder of the tour as a headliner. So Fritz von Erich must have said to Baba, please take care of this guy, when I'm gone. It's like Baba used him as a headliner ever since. It's really hard in Japan to develop a new headliner foreigner.
So, Fumi, looking back on these 4 tours that Pampero Firpo participated in, 3 with JWA, 1 with All Japan.
Yeah, 10 years later, yeah.
Did the fans remember him? Was he someone who made a memorable impression on the Japanese wrestling fans?
More, to be honest with you, more with reading-oriented fans. when you go to Japanese wrestling, like a Budokan or, Sumo Palace or Korakuen Hall, maybe Korakuen Hall with, 1,700 people, they are all hardcores, read everything, watch everything, know everything kind of wrestling fan. But when you go to Budokan or Sumo Palace with 10,000 to 15,000, 16,000, you will have good number of more casual fans, right? Yeah, so Pampero Firpo was a type of wrestler that would be remembered by more reading-oriented fans. This guy speaks 5 different languages. He's been to different places. He's been to Madison Square Garden. He was America's heavyweight champion in LA. He had a big feud with the Sheik in Detroit. All those things, Yeah. It's too bad that he did not have like a single title match against people like Giant Baba, But that was how it was, I guess. During this World League tour, like 67 and 70, they did not have single title match or tag team title matches. It's all, tournament matches, so it was how it was done. And, yeah. But I'm not going to say he wasn't a headliner in Japan. He was the type of wrestler that serious wrestling fan would always remember.
I am very happy to welcome to the Super Podcast today a man known by many different names. Some may know him as Dave Drayson. Some may know him as Dave Burzynski. And Dave Burzynski is on the line right now. Dave, thanks for being here today.
Hey, Brian, it's always great to talk to you, my friend. I always say you're number 1, even though Jim Cornette says you smell like number 2.
Well, hey, we could save that for another time, but we're here to talk about something else here today, and that is Pampero Firpo and the legacy he leaves behind in Detroit with big-time wrestling. And there's no one better to talk to than you about big-time wrestling and Detroit wrestling, the Sheik, and everything else. So before we get going with anything else, give us a little bit of your background. When did you start watching wrestling in Detroit?
I started watching basically around 1961, only because at the time, my family, my parents owned a 2-story house on the east side of Detroit. And at one point in time, the new residents who moved upstairs from us was a family. And come to find out, it was like the most popular wrestler in Detroit at the time, Leaping Larry Shane. So once I found that out, it's like I started watching him on TV, and it's like, holy crap, I got a famous, wrestler, living upstairs from me. And so I started watching every week. And, I would always see Larry, and his wife and stuff, and he'd be away on, road trips and things like that. And he took me to my very first live wrestling thing. What they used to do in Detroit at the time on Channel 7, they would do a show in the afternoon to promote the show at Kobo at night. And Larry asked my mother, he says, hey, I'm going to the TV thing. You mind if I take Dave along? And it's like, she said, fine. And I'm like, holy crap, this is great. So anyway, I go to the TV studio, for the, live show with Larry. And as soon as we walk in the very front door of the studio, out from like another doorway down the hall, like peeks out Ricky the Crusher Cortez. And it's like, oh my God, I'm like a 6-7-year-old kid at the time, and these guys were behemoths to me. They were, they looked like giants, and I knew Ricky Cortez was Larry Shane's biggest nemesis at the time, and he came out, and it's like I thought they were going to go at it right in the hallway. I was scared to death. And, Ricky saw us and he went back in, and I'm like, oh, God, thank you. And the ironic thing about that is, like, later on, I'd say many years later, like 15 years later, I became Ricky the Crusher Cortez's manager. So that's, and I started, I always watched. That was my first show. And then Larry got killed in a car accident coming back from a show in 1964, and then I started going on my own in early 1965, and from 1965 on, I don't think I missed a Kobo show. I was taking my camera. I, started, trading pictures and, have pen pals with, lifelong friends to this day, like Diane Devine and, Tom Burke and Danny Goddard and so many others. And then, I started submitting my photos to all the wrestling magazines, Wrestling Review, Wrestling World, Ring Wrestling, Wrestling Monthly, all of them. And my pictures started appearing in there. I started writing stories because they said, if we use your pictures for a story, it's $25. If you do a story, it's $50. So in like the late 60s, that's a lot of money for a young kid. That's what I did until the time I got lucky to become the photographer for Big Time Wrestling, the Sheik's Big Time Wrestling. Then I started writing the Body Press program and started doing everything, during the big years, that he had in 72, 73, where every show was a sellout in Detroit here. And it was the greatest time of my life for wrestling.
There's so much Detroit wrestling history to talk to you about, and we're going to definitely do more segments with you here on the 605 Super Podcast in the future. But to hone in on Pampero Firpo, set the stage. What was going on in Detroit? What was big-time wrestling like when Pampero Firpo first arrived?
Well, you have to understand that, the Sheik, when he bought the promotion in 1965, he had, a lot of his friends would come in, guys, that he met along the way in all the different territories. He had Johnny Valentine, who was up in years at that time, Bull Curry. And I say that the Sheik, he, unlike a lot of the other territories that, built their promotions around, skilled wrestlers and, things like, just different territories had that kind of, thing. But what the Sheik did, he built his promotion on all these characters that, he had met, over his time, wrestling around the, country and the world. And when I say characters, he had everything from cowboys, Indians, Germans, Canadians, Mexicans, girls, midgets. He even brought in like Haystack Calhoun, the McGuire twins, so they were the oddities. He always liked masked men. And then, the other oddity character guys like, Igor and Thunderbolt Patterson and JB Psycho. And it's like, when Firpo came in, his character fit right in with big time wrestling with this kind of theme, characters.
How familiar were you with Pampero Firpo before you arrived, from being so involved in reading the magazines and taking photos and et cetera?
That's all I really knew, Firpo. It's like, had respect for him. I, saw him in the magazines, first when he was like out on the West Coast, in San Francisco area. And then he went to the AWA, and then I would see stories from like, my friends, like Jim Melby and George Shire, who were doing stories and, pictures that I would see in the magazines. And it's like, the way they talked him up, here's this like shorter kind of character with this bushy hair and, short, stout build. And it's like, how can he compete against, guys that are like almost a foot taller than him, but, the way they built him up as like this larger than life character, from the jungles of Argentina or, the wild bull of the Pampas. And it's like, oh man, when's he coming to Detroit? This would be great to have him here. So when he finally did come here, his first appearance in Detroit was December the 4th, 1971 at Cobo Arena. And at the time, he was 41 years old. So it's like, I think of it now. I didn't think of it then. But, like guys like Johnny Valentine and Igor and so many others.
In his 50s, yeah.
Yeah. They're like, really should be past their prime. But, guys like that, you got to take a Bull Curry, small in stature and stuff. Even, Pampero Firpo, smaller in stature, but, stout. But they were a character, and they made you believe, that was their whole thing. And it's like, that's what the Sheik had, going for him here, and that's why he was selling out so much. He had these guys who had been around for, a good number of years, and they were a character. And, the fans here, they got to know these characters and love these characters and fear these characters and believe these characters. Like I said, Firpo first appeared December the 4th, 1971, and he went over and he beat Jesse Ortega. And then, didn't see anything of him until 2 weeks later. He, came back to Cobo 2 weeks later, and he beat Sonny King. And then knowing what I know now, it's like that's the only shows he did was Detroit Cobo Arena. He was still finishing up in his AWA shows, for Vern Gagne. But then, I found out that he ended up buying a home in Owasso, Michigan at the start of 1972. And at that time, his first, big appearance regular was in Toronto the day after Christmas, where he beat Mike Lauren. The next day, he came to Detroit and he beat Lord Layton. And then from, the start of 1972, he was full-time here in Detroit. And mostly he was started off tag teaming really with, in main events, with the Sheik, Bull Curry, and all the big heels at the time. And he immediately, after only, a few showings here in Detroit, he made a major impact. And the fans, like I said, they bought into his characters. And, when he would do his promos and he'd be in the ring, everybody knows he did the, oh, yeah. And people would, they'd be copying it. I'd be on the streets and, stuff. And, wrestling fans, they'd be, walking around town, it's like on a weekday going, oh, yeah. And, he was very popular and he made an impact right off the bat here in Detroit.
Couple questions for you coming out of this. One, before his first appearance on December 4th, 71, did any promos from Pampero Firpo air on the TV show? And what was the format of the TV show in Detroit at this period of time?
At that time, it was studio. They would film at Channel 62, I believe, out of Walled Lake, Michigan. They would, after the Cobo show on Saturday, they'd go to the studio on Sunday. They would film 2 weeks worth of matches. And that's where fans, who came in, they would find out what the next big card was, because Lord Layton would run down the card and they'd find out who was going to be on the next big Cobo show 2 weeks later. So it was, probably 4 or 5 squash matches. After each guy's match, they'd come out of the ring. Lord Layton would, be in front of the camera with them right at the ringside. They do their 2 or 3 minute promo to, promote their upcoming match, at the next Cobo show. And that's the way the show ran.
71 and 72, what time did it air in Detroit and what day?
Usually a Thursday night. I believe it was 8 or 9 o'clock. And sometimes they would repeat that show Saturday morning at 11 o'clock. And, that was the two things. And then, especially the 11 o'clock showing on the Saturday of the Cobo show, they hoped that they could promote it, the show enough to fill it up. And starting in, 72, once Firpo came in, people were turned away at Cobo Arena, because almost every show for almost a year and a half, 2 years was a sellout.
And in a territory with so many different characters, his promos immediately stood out?
Oh, yeah. How couldn't they? How couldn't they? He'd be in front of the camera, the big bushy hair, big eyes, looking, and his, big thick accent and, the way he would talk, it's like, it just looked and sounded mean. And, with his big thick accent, like, oh, and he would, almost like yell and, he'd bring you right in, to his, promos. And at one point, sometimes he would have his fingers, the front of his fingers painted black, because that's when he was doing like the El Garfio, almost claw kind of thing. And then there was times that he would bring out Chimu, his little shrunken head, and, he'd be petting, the top of his head. And it's like, holy, it's like, how couldn't people, figure, either this guy is crazy nuts or whatever, but what he did, it brought fans in. Like I said, selling out all over the territory at the time.
If it was nowadays, they would be selling Chimus at every concession stand in the building.
Oh, yeah. Well, in late, in the big time wrestling promotion, they came up with these pennants. They had, these diamond pennants. And, I recently saw a Firpo one. They had, everybody, the Sheik, Bobo, Johnny Valentine, Bull Curry. But it's like it was after I had already left. And, I wish I would have got some of these, pennants. But, yeah, could you imagine him selling, like, Chimu dolls or, these big afro, black hair things, to make them look like Firpo, just everything.
You mentioned Toronto earlier, so I want to clarify this because some listeners may not know this. Some people think of Toronto, they may think, Mid-Atlantic Wrestling and then the WWF. But for many years, Toronto was getting their talent from the Sheik and from Detroit.
Well, the Sheik and Frank Tunney, they formed a partnership in let's say the late 60s. And the Sheik would supply, I'd say 50% of the talent. And another 50% of the talent was guys from around Hamilton, Ontario, like the Love Brothers and Chris and John Tolis, Dewey Robertson, Murray Cummings, and even, like some of the old stalwarts that they were, we always call them Tunney guys, Bulldog Lee Henning, who, he looked 80 years old when he was 30, and, so many guys like that, they would have on the Toronto shows, and a lot of those guys would come down also and be on the Cobo Arena shows.
Firpo arrives there, and by early 72, he is established as a regular in the territory. How does he get over? Obviously, he's a heel when he comes in. What is his first major program?
His first ones, he was tag teaming with the Sheik mainly, against, always two of the top baby faces, and, one of them would always be Bobo Brazil, and it's like, false finishes and DQs and just all out massive wars in the ring. And that was his, what he did at the start. And then, he started working singles things, against Bobo and then Tony Marino and Ben Justice and Fred Curry and, just all the, top baby faces. And, Firpo was over, and, I can't remember anybody ever pinning him during, a good amount of that, I'll say first 2 years, 72 through 74. He may have, the only way he would have lost back then is through a DQ or a count out or something like that. But the big turning point came in 1974 where there was a tag team match, and I believe it was a cage, with the Sheik and Pampero Firpo against Bobo Brazil and Tony Marino. I could be wrong on the Tony Marino, but I know it was Bobo and somebody else. And for the finish, Sheik was going to throw fire, and Firpo was holding somebody in like a, holding them from behind. And I think it was Bobo, and Sheik goes to throw the fire, and Bobo ducks, and he hits Firpo with the fire. And Firpo goes down, he's blinded, and then that set up the thing for the Sheik versus Pampero Firpo and Firpo's babyface turn.
There were some great photos in the body press at that period of time of Firpo with a couple of nurses. It looked almost like a full thing, like he had these giant bandages over his eyes, and they were really selling it like they don't know if he'll ever return. His left eye is damaged more than the right eye. Was it a big deal on TV, too? Was it really played up that Firpo may never come back?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, he didn't come back at first. Whenever the Sheik would throw the fire, to, really emphasize the end of a babyface heel run with him, he'd burn a guy with the fire, and then they'd go away for a month or two. And that happened, my first time I remember that is in 1972, Johnny Valentine. Sheik blinded Johnny Valentine with, the fire. And then a couple of weeks later, with the Sheik's permission, I went out to L.A. to work in the L.A. office for a month because my good friends Don Wilson, Bob Kubik, Larry Korn, and Jeff Walton, they invited me out there. And so I stayed out there for like a month and a half. And I helped them out in the office. I set up the ring and ran box office and, did anything, I could to help out the promotion. And then, like, especially at the Olympic shows, they ran that themselves. That was, self-running. I was lucky enough to, go down to the ring and, photograph all these things and got to, meet all the boys, like Fred Blassie and John Tolis and things. And it's like, at first, when I came out there, Mike LaBelle let us use one of his houses in Beverly Hills. So we had this gorgeous, huge house that he gave, let us use. And it's like right off of La Cienega Boulevard. And the thing I'll remember about being in that house at first, my very first day there, Don Wilson picks me up at the airport. We go to this house and we pull up and it's like, holy crap, look at this beautiful house. So then we go inside and Don shows me to my room up on the second floor. I walk into this room and it's like navy blue velvet walls. And it had to be 30 by 40 feet long, my bedroom. And it's like, holy Jesus. So then, for the heck of it, I'm checking stuff out, put my bag down, and then I go in the bathroom, and it's like, a young kid, of my age. I was, 72. I was 17 years old. I walk into the bathroom, and I go, wow, now this is class. There was 2 toilets. And I'm thinking, well, there's a toilet to poop in, and there's a toilet to pee in. Now, how much, better can it get? And then it's like, I go to this one toilet that doesn't have a seat on it. So it's like, oh, this is the one I pee in. So it's like, well, dig this. There's a little foot thing that you press, to flush. So I press that thing and a shot of water come out of there. And it's like, I was soaking wet. And it's like, holy Jesus. So I go downstairs and say, hey, what's up with this toilet, down on the second floor? And they go, no, that's a bidet. I go, what the hell's a bidet? It's like, and then I sort of found out from there on. But that's my story on, we had an Olympic-sized pool in the backyard, and all the, shots at that time were pretty short, only, half hour to maybe our longest shot was 2.5 hours away. So we were home every night, and then, we'd always, be out at the pool and stuff and having a great time. So back to, the story, I'm out there shooting, photographs one day, and, Johnny Valentine, he's here. And it's like, he sees me in the dressing room, and it's like, what the hell are you doing here? And this is only like a week and a half after he got burnt by the Sheik, and he was on his way to Japan. So it's like, well, hey, I'm out here working for the office and stuff. And it's like, I would see guys like that. And same thing with Firpo. Firpo gets burnt. He sees me out in L.A., and it's like, okay, you must be going to Japan, eh, Firp? It's like, oh, yes, Davey. So, and, even guys, another story, very short, quick story on that. Johnny Powers, his first trip to Japan, he gets to L.A., and he doesn't have a passport. So there, Don's wife, Judy Wilson, who was also working in the offices at the time, had to get, Johnny Powers a passport in like 2 days before he left for Japan. It's like, that's one of those kind of stories. But anyway, and then, Firpo comes back to like, Detroit, and, going to work the program with the Sheik, and, they built it up, and you mentioned, the photographs in the body press, those are all stage pictures that we took. We took those at Firpo's house. It's like, oh, Dave, we need pictures for, it's like, oh, okay. So I went up to Owasso, and, he got these gals. I don't know who they were. I don't think they were even nurses. And, they put all these bandages on them. I'm taking photographs, and, and that's, the stuff that appeared in, the body press.
How did he get over as a babyface after a couple of years there as a heel, teaming with the top heel, of course, the Sheik, who owned the territory? Finally, he turns babyface. Did he instantly get over?
Oh yeah, he was the number one babyface. As soon as he turned, the fans did a 180 also. Boom. Yeah, he was the biggest babyface in the territory at the time.
It's interesting because while he was on top in Detroit, he did work other places. In 72, he worked in New York. In 74, he was back in Los Angeles. So even though he was on top in Detroit, he was still making shots in other places, and big shots at that.
Yeah, he was that big and popular and in demand. Even Chic, same thing. Going to Hawaii and doing shots in L.A. and down in Atlanta. At that time, at their age and their careers, if they were in demand, oh man, they'd take that big paycheck.
He was billed always as the eighth wonder of the world. So what did you think the first time you heard Andre the Giant called the eighth wonder of the world?
I didn't think much about it. Whatever title they wanted to use. But in recent time, it was only a few days ago, I'm on Facebook, and the news that Firpo had passed came down. And on a couple friends, Facebook pages, I had done a tribute video, an 8-minute tribute video on Pampero Firpo a few years ago, on a lot of my photographs of him in Detroit. And the title of it is Pampero Firpo, the Eighth Wonder of the World. And some fan, after I posted it, wrote, Pampero Firpo ain't no Eighth Wonder of the World, Andre the Giant is. And it's like, a couple friends come to my defense and say, well, before Andre the Giant billed himself as that, Pampero Firpo did. And it's like, okay, well, this fan, he had to be some young kid, so probably, Randy Macho Man Savage came up with the phrase, oh yeah. And, I said a couple other things about, other wrestlers who had, did the gorgeous thing. It's like, Gorgeous George. Oh, no, Gorgeous George. Gorgeous Jimmy Garvin was the first gorgeous guy. And it's like, come on. You learn your wrestling history. Firpo had his babyface turn from 1974 through 1977. In 1977, he was, getting up in age, and I know even, when he first came to Detroit, he was always telling guys in the dressing room, don't hit me in the stomach. I think he had some kind of surgery, prior that, because I know the story that I heard before was Jim Lancaster. He would tell Jim Lancaster, don't hit me in the stomach. You hit me in the stomach, I die. So I don't know what operation he had, but I know he had stomach problems. So I think through 1977 through the start of 1979, and it's when the territory started to go down. And I know Firpo really had a problem when the Sheik had his son, Eddie Farhat Jr., also known as the Captain Ed George. Firpo hated that. First of all, Firpo hated him, and he hated that the Sheik was putting him in the ring at that time. So, and I know, and that happened right about 1977, and Firpo left. He didn't want to be around it, and from 77 through 79, he just left. And then in early 79, mid 79, he came back because the Sheik's, territory was, in shambles. They couldn't draw nothing at Kobo. Where else was Firpo going to go at the time? So many of the other guys that the Sheik was using then, they were old guys. The fans had seen enough of it. They knew, their gimmick had, soured. They knew what they were going to see. They were going to see 5-minute matches. And, the guys that, the Sheik had working for him at the time, all his old friends that were trying to help him save the territory, they just had nothing left in the tank to give the fans at all.
In terms of the downfall of the Detroit promotion, did the economy play into it at all?
Oh, yes. It was like a double-edged sword at the time. The economy was starting to hurt. Things were getting bad around the city. The car companies were having trouble. the sports teams, the Red Wings, the Lions, the Lions always suck around here, so you ain't got to worry about that. The Tigers sucked, and, the Pistons, they weren't much better. All the sports teams around town, they sucked. They couldn't draw fans, and it's like, wrestling, fans had had enough of, the big-time wrestling stuff, and just everything suffered around here.
And meanwhile, in 72, it was a completely different story. You had Firpo come in there and get over. You had Billy Martin managing the Tigers. That was a great period of time.
Yep. Yeah, and the Tigers made the playoffs in 72. They lost to the Oakland A's in the playoffs, the American League playoff anyway.
And then they fired Billy Martin in the summer of 73, I believe. So he didn't last too much longer there. When it comes to the glory days of Detroit wrestling, what do you see as the height? What is the peak of Detroit wrestling?
1972. The start of 1972 through the end of 1973, early 1974. And that's for big-time wrestling. But also at the time, you have to remember that the Bruiser was here with his promotion. He was running opposition to the Sheik. He was drawing decent at first, but then he had the same guys week after week. It was Bruiser and Von Raschke and the Blackjacks and Billy Red Cloud. The only person that was really holding that whole thing together, the Bruiser's name, but the only excitement at those shows was Bobby Heenan, even though he was managing, and, then he'd get in the ring also, and the fans loved seeing him get his ass beat. So in the beginning, the Bruiser promotion, they did okay, maybe 4,000 or 5,000. But toward the end, in 1974, they weren't even drawing 2,000 to the Olympia. And, that's when, I think Bruiser saw the writing on the wall. I don't know the story because, I wasn't, in the wrestling office, and I don't know the inner workings, what happened with Sheik and Bruiser. But, they kissed and made up. And, when at the end of, I think it was October of 74 was the first Dick the Bruiser versus the Sheik, and an instant sellout. And they worked the program, I think, 4, shows in a row. DQ, counted out of the ring, cage match, the whole shebang. But, and then, Sheik started working, some of the Indianapolis shows for the Bruiser, and a few as his other spot show. I think Evanston and a couple other of his Indiana towns. He came back for a few shows in 1979 and 1980. He worked also, just because, Sheik shows weren't doing anything good. During the summer, the Bear Man, Dave McKegney, had his thing going in Canada, mainly Ontario, and he'd go up to Newfoundland and stuff. And I know Firpo worked a handful of shows for him, and I'm sure it was probably for the payoff. And then at the end of 1980, that's when Firpo had enough. And I think it was in 1981 where he basically retired from in-ring action.
So looking back on these years, the Pampero Firpo years in Detroit, what's the legacy he leaves behind, Dave?
Oh, he's on the Mount Rushmore, no doubt about it. There's been, talk online about, I'll say big-time wrestling, who's on the Mount Rushmore. Well, okay, Sheik, Bobo Brazil. Okay, who's going to fill those next 2 slots? Okay, you can't only think of, the Sheik's big-time wrestling. You have to include, Dick the Bruiser there. Because Bruiser was, big in like the very late 50s, very early 60s when they had shows at the Olympia Stadium for, Jim Barnett was running then. I mean, he was big. I mean, he was holding, the town together. He was wrestling in Detroit at the time. And then it's a toss-up. I would almost have to put Firpo as number 4, but there's been other people who say, the mighty Igor, should be up there. And Igor, he came in here in, I believe, 1968, and he lasted all the way till the end in 1980 with the Sheik. Igor lived in Dearborn, Michigan, so he was, very local. And even after, Sheik's promotion folded, there was a few guys. Malcolm Monroe ran shows. Ricky Cortez ran shows. and Mike Anthony ran shows. And, Igor would be on the ones with Ricky Cortez. I was managing, Chic at the time. I was managing Malcolm Monroe. I was managing the Fabulous Kangaroos, Mickey Doyle and Al Costello, and then later Mickey Doyle and Al Snow. So Igor would be on those shows, and it's a toss-up. Those five, I can't see anybody else replacing those five as the Mount Rushmore of Detroit professional wrestling.
Well, Dave, before we wrap this segment up, obviously you were someone who was around during those years. You were someone backstage during those years. What are your personal thoughts and memories of Pampero Firpo? What kind of guy was he?
First and foremost in the ring, one of the most exciting characters I've ever seen in wrestling in my years anywhere, not only in Detroit, but around the world. But the one thing, I would have to say about Pampero personally is that he was such a nice man. He was always a gentleman. Whenever he, saw you, it didn't matter if it was in Detroit or it'd be shows in, Dayton or Toledo or Cincinnati. He always came up to you, shook your hand, asked how you were doing. He was always a gentleman. And, in the wrestling world, there's not too many guys, and I probably count on one hand and maybe one foot, that there's those guys that you never heard a bad word about, and I'd say one of those guys, good friend Louis Martinez, but I'd also have to say I never heard a bad word in the dressing room or anywhere else when it regarded Pampero Firpo.
As we look at the life and career of Pampero Firpo, let's spend a few minutes looking at Pampero Firpo's run in the WWWF in 1972, and to do that with us, the host of Pro Wrestling Spotlight and Pro Wrestling Spotlight Then and Now. He's your friend and mine, John Arezzi. John, thanks for being here today.
Oh, my pleasure, Brian. Certainly a sad situation with Pampero Firpo, one of the legends, and happy to do this.
There are such a great number of heels that came into the territory during the Pedro Morales years. Just so many interesting characters, Don Leo Jonathan, Moondog Mayne, Fred Blassie. So many guys came in, so many guys main evented against Pedro. What do you remember about when Pampero Firpo first came in?
Well, I do remember his first TV appearance and his debut, and he had already been booked for the Garden against Chief Jay Strongbow. And he just had a presence. He had that charisma. He had that wild look. He had that voice. He had the hair. He had the beard. He was all hairy. He was a presence and very, very believable.
If you were a dedicated fan like you were at this period of time, how aware would you have been of Pampero Firpo? Was it a name and a face that you recognized from the magazines? Was he new to you? How well known was Pampero Firpo to you when he came to New York?
Oh, he's very well known because I read about him in the magazines. And you'd always get excited watching wrestling back then. And for names that you'd only read about in the national wrestling magazines, and when they would show up, you'd get really excited. And I was really in my infancy of going to live shows at the time in 1972. I'd only been going to the Garden less than a year live. I've been following wrestling for a long time, obviously, but that was a real special time. And I do remember during that time period that, that I'd always, with my little tape recorder, I'd just be taping, wrestling off the TV. And first time I heard his voice, it was kind of like, wow, this guy's great. And he was with the Grand Wizard, but he was very believable. And you would always, at the time, I wasn't a big Morales fan because I was always a Bruno guy. You would always hope that the villain would come in and beat Morales. And that's what I was hoping for when Firpo came in, especially.
He had the Grand Wizard by his side. The Grand Wizard was a fantastic interview, but Pampero Firpo on his own was a memorable wrestling interview. What do you remember about those interviews? Did they stand out right away? Because you did have so many great heels coming in and out of the territory around this period of time.
No, it was just kind of his, the believability and the yelling and the raspy voice and the fact that he was billed from Argentina and it was just kind of a different. He was like a jungle man. He was like the wild man of the jungle, and you remember him. And the first time he opened his mouth and spoke after the Wizard introduced him, it was really memorable. It was great.
So, did you actually attend the shows in the Garden when he came in?
Yes. And it was only 2 shots. I think it was against Strongbow, and he won on a count out, I believe. And for Strongbow to lose at the Garden, that was unheard of anyway. Strongbow never lost. And then the next month, it was in May of 72, he had the 1 shot against Morales. It was out, and then it was done. It was quick.
He was working regularly at this period of time in Detroit. And he came into New York and he did these shots. Was it disappointing to you that it was quick? Did you hope that you would have more Pampero Firpo in New York?
Absolutely, because he was so great. And he was in and he was out. And in such a quick period of time, it was really literally over a couple months. And I don't know if he might have had another shot with Morales in either Philly or Boston. But his work in New York was very short, but very memorable.
Any other memories or anecdotes about Pampero Firpo?
When you talk on a personal level, I mean, we were so enthralled with him and my sister, who's 5 years younger than me. And at the time in 72, I was 15. So my sister was 10. And my mom, Italian mother as she was, would yell and scream at us. And we got so even my older sister was 5 years older. I mean, we all just kind of fell in love with Firpo, and we'd run around the house imitating him. And then we started calling my mother Firpo when she started. And that was actually, it lasted a lot longer than his run in New York because Firpo was so memorable. And my mother didn't know what the hell we were talking about. We'd just be calling her Firpo, constantly calling her Firpo. And we'd be yelling at each other in Firpo's voice, me and my sister. So very memorable. He left a lifelong impression and very fond memories to this day.
You just heard my conversation with John Arezzi, sharing his memories of Pampero Firpo in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. Thankfully, John recorded audio off TV of many of the great moments that happened in the early 1970s. Moments that there's no video of. From the best of my knowledge, there's no video in circulation. There's no video in the WWE vaults from this period of time. So the audio we're about to hear is the only evidence that exists of Pampero Firpo's debut in the WWWF. We're going to hear the first promo he did with his manager, the Grand Wizard, and a young Vince McMahon who had just started as commentator. And then we're going to hear some audio of Pampero Firpo's first match on TV on Championship Wrestling. Let's go to this audio right now.
I was 16-year professional, and when you have a midline coaching, you have to give 200% what you have.
Thank you very much, and best of luck to you, Tim. Also on the card is Pampero Firpo, represented here to my left, the Grand Wizard of Wrestling.
Well, Vince, right now I am going to give you and every viewer a treat you have never had before. Let me introduce to you the 8th wonder of the world, Pampero Firpo. And the only reason that yours truly, the Grand Wizard, is here for this gentleman, he will not be victimized by the sharpshooters in this area, therefore I will be with him. But now you will hear words of wisdom from Pampero Firpo.
Oh, yeah. I came to this part of the country after a long absence to destroy, pulverize all my opponents. Next in line will be the Indian. What is his name?
Hey, Strongbow.
Yeah. I will scout him and strong his head back here. Y a Pedro Morales también en la lista.
Pampero Firpo, represented by, of course, the Grand Wizard of Wrestling.
In this corner wearing the black tights from the
Detroit, Michigan, weighing 235 pounds, Tom Reisman. And his opponent making his first appearance in the ring, he calls himself the eighth wonder of the world, from the jungles of South America, Pampero Firpo. His weight 245 pounds, and his manager, the Grand Wizard.
Well, there you have it. And I mean, this gentleman is a wild bull from Argentina, Pampero Firpo.
Wrestling Federation heavyweight champion Pedro Morales. That five-star wrestling blockbuster supported by other strong matches in Madison Square Garden this coming Monday night, April 17th.
Well, he calls himself the eighth wonder of the world, and look at him, you can tell why. Have you ever seen anything like that in your life? Pampero Firpo working on Tom Reed. There it is, submission hold, tremendous strength. You saw Tom Reisman go flying across the ring when Pampero Firpo literally threw him after Reisman had a handful of air. Pampero Firpo. Let's go up to Buddy Wagner.
Big time, ladies and gentlemen, 2 minutes and 59 seconds. Here is the winner in his debut, Pampero Firpo.
The wild bull from the Argentine. We'll have more action for you on Championship Wrestling in just a moment.
We continue our look at Pampero Firpo here this week on the 605 Super Podcast with an old friend of the show. Happy to welcome him back today, Jeff Walton. Jeff, thanks for being here.
Brian, it's always a pleasure. I love the show, and anything I can do to spread eyes, I'm glad to do it.
Well, I don't know about that. You usually have some really good takes because you were so intimately involved with the Los Angeles booking office. And let's talk about that. Let's talk about Pampero Firpo in Los Angeles, in Southern California. To take a step back, do you remember when you first heard about Pampero Firpo?
Well, like everybody else, in the 70s, you read about in the magazines, in Wrestling Review and Ring Wrestling and Wrestling World and Inside Wrestling. They all had stories about Firpo and, of course, the different places that he worked. And, predominantly it was, I think, in the Michigan market, in Detroit, and then again, of course, in New York and Madison Square Garden, he worked. I don't think there was a place that he didn't work, really. He was a pretty good draw.
Jeff, the Los Angeles office would rejoin the NWA in 1968, and it's a little over a year before that the America's title is introduced into Los Angeles. You had the WWA World Champion, and now you had a secondary title, the America's title. What was the purpose of the America's title? And especially after the office rejoined the NWA, what was the importance of the America's title?
Well, I think to a degree we were preparing for the America's title to be our major championship. It was like the United States Heavyweight Championship, only this title represented North America and South America. So you had that flavor in there. So I think that's probably the reason that we were grooming the America's title, as you might say, as being the number one championship here in Southern California.
Pampero Firpo was the first champion. He wins a fictitious match against Colosso Colisetti. Did Pampero Firpo instantly get over in Los Angeles, and how memorable were his promos in that era when you had a lot of really strong talkers on TV? You had Fred Blassie regularly on TV. Did Firpo immediately get over?
Yes, and the reason why was because of his talking. Anybody that came across as a strong talker on television was very successful here in Southern California. The work was something else as far as how they worked and everything. Of course, that was priority. But if you could talk here, you were a big hit. And think about this. Here's a guy that comes on and he's like a bull. His hair is wild. Even though he's short in stature, you don't really recognize that on television if your announcer is not that tall. And you had Dick Lane, you had myself. This guy came across as a wild bull. And if you did wild interviews with him doing crazy Sheik-like stuff, then the chances of getting over were very, very good.
Well, let me ask you about the Sheik, because this plays into the story a little bit later. When did the Sheik first come to Los Angeles? And again, similar to Pampero Firpo, although the Sheik didn't really do promos, did the Sheik instantly get over with the Los Angeles fans?
Oh, yeah. He had a reputation already. That was around I would say around 1972. In fact, it might have been a little bit earlier because he's on the Coliseum card in 71. So he was amazing as far as what he could do, and even his interviews where he didn't really talk at all, but he ran around and he would take my glasses or he would cut my tie, and of course just be a complete crazy guy. I mean, people wanted to see him get beat, and who could beat him but Freddie Blassie or any Mil Mascaras, anybody. They had hopes that would stop this guy, and his reputation preceded him.
A few years after Pampero Firpo's America's title reign, in 74, he's now a main event star in Detroit. They're doing major business. He has a big babyface turn against the Sheik. And he's brought back to Los Angeles, and he has a pretty nice little run there while also working in Detroit. What was the relationship like between the Detroit office, the Sheik, Ed Farhat, and Mike LaBelle in the Los Angeles office? And what do you remember about Pampero Firpo returning in 1974?
Well, the relationship was extremely close because now the Sheik has a good reputation out here. He came out here on his off weeks. He wasn't headlining Cobo, and he was headlining here at the Olympic. And for a while, Mike gave him the book so that he could book. And he was sending minor league talent out here to work to see if they got over. And he himself was in main events. The problem, though, is our fans were really serious about their wrestling. And when you got a Sheik match, you got maybe 30 seconds, if not 2 minutes. If you went 2 minutes with the Sheik, that was way too long. Most of his stuff, his shtick was, entering the ring and leaving the ring and whatever he did outside the ring in between. So the matches didn't last long. But the relationship between Mike and the Sheik was extremely close. And Sheik came in a lot of times with his wife, Joyce. Mike and his wife, Molly, went shopping together in Beverly Hills and Rodeo Drive, and the Sheik loved to do that. He loved Western boots, and so he would go to one of the finest stores in Beverly Hills, pick out boots almost every time he came. And that was a very close relationship for a while until things turned south for the Sheik years later.
And what about Pampero Firpo returning to Los Angeles? Obviously, he's the first champion in 67. 1974 is several years later. Did the fans still remember him? How over was he? Now he's a babyface in there, and they even brought some of those matches against the Sheik into Los Angeles off the strength of the program in Detroit. What do you remember about that?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's one of the reasons. And Sheik thought it would be, he thought he would be able to sell out with Firpo here as well as in Cobo. And they did do some really good cards and matches together, but I don't think it was the same. I don't remember any of the matches being sellouts. We did very well with them, but again, Firpo came in the second time. He was known by a lot of fans, but I think Firpo was beginning to slow down a little bit, as I remember, the second time he came in. So his work rate wasn't like it was in the late 60s. And I don't take anything away from Firpo. I think part of it, of course, was the Sheik, but Firpo was always a good worker. He could wrestle any style because he had learned so much in the business, and he was so dedicated to the business that he gave 100% in all his matches.
What was the Los Angeles territory like in '74? So this is before Louis Tillett comes in as the booker. The Sheik was the booker during this period of time?
Well, no, he never was really the booker, but he would tell Mike what he thought matches should be like. So for a while, Mike was listening to him as far as what he thought, and of course he put himself on top all the time. And like I said, after a while, you knew how the people reacted, and they would come in and they would say, "Oh, the Sheik's on the card, he's the main event, and the match isn't going to go that long." And they were right, because the Sheik never wanted to work that long. He wanted to do his gimmick and get out. Firpo could work. Firpo could wrestle anybody for an hour, 90 minutes, whatever. He could work. It was a different type of thing. And I think, we used Firpo here as a baby face as well as a heel. So, we saw both ways with him.
How well did you get to know him? Did you have a lot of talks with him? You are working in the office.
Yeah, I got to know him really, really well. And toward the end of his run, he came up to me after we did interviews one day, and he said, "Jeff," he said, let me talk to you. I want to talk to you." And I said, "Uh-oh, shit," the way he's so serious, He says, I've got a problem. My daughter, my little daughter, she's not well, and she needs care, and she needs health. And I said, "You mean insurance?" And he says, "Yeah, insurance." And he says, I don't have that in the wrestling business." He says, what do you think I should do? Well, I was startled by this because I couldn't see. This was such an intelligent man. He spoke 7 languages, Portuguese, French, German, English, Italian. This guy, Spanish, which he got over very well with the Spanish-speaking people. But I didn't know what to tell him, and I said, Juan, I said, "I'll tell you," I said, "if you're really seriously thinking about," he says, I'm thinking about getting out of the wrestling business. I have to get proper care for my daughter. And, I don't think it was only for his daughter. I think it was for himself as well, because he was getting older. And I said, you should look into the civil service field, such as the police department, the postal department, anything that's civil service, because you could retire from the civil service department in some sort of position, and you'd have insurance for your family and for yourself. And that's exactly what he did.
He would later go to work for the post office.
Exactly.
Famously, the post office that Dave Meltzer used to mail out the Wrestling Observer newsletter.
I heard that. I don't know how true that is. Probably is if Dave says so. But that wasn't the issue. He wanted to homestead. He wanted to live in an area that was good for his family, and he found that up north in San Jose or around that area was a good area, and so I guess he settled there, and then decided, of course, to leave the business and go into the civil service branch, which he never regretted. He was with the civil service department for over 30 years.
Jeff, looking back on the life and career of Pampero Firpo, you called him Juan, so obviously you knew him even beyond the character and the gimmick. What are you going to best remember about him? How should he be remembered by wrestling fans?
Well, other than a quick mention that I've seen that, Pampero Firpo passed away at age 89, he deserves more than that. He deserves to be accredited by a lot of the serious major wrestling groups that award wrestlers for their work, and also for a lot of things that, he was a good man. He was he would help others. I know he would. And if you needed anything and he liked you, you got it from him. This was a kind, gentle, knowledgeable human being. For being in the wrestling business, this man was extremely intelligent. He could have gone a lot farther than he did. It was just a time when you went from territory to territory to territory, and you didn't stay in one place for any length of time. He traveled. He knew all the countries. He knew about countries. He knew if you were going to go on vacation, he would tell you exactly what you should see and where you should go. And I think that he should be remembered as one of the very finest wrestlers that ever put on tights.
Well, there it is, a special 605 Super Podcast look at the life and career of the legendary Pampero Firpo. I really want to thank all of our guests this week, as well as Bill Atkinson of 50th State BigTimeWrestling.com and John Arezzi of Pro Wrestling Spotlight Then and Now for contributing audio that otherwise would not have been heard to this program. But until next time, for all of my guests, I'm the great Brian Last. Tally-ho!